Beatrice Caldwell pressed the bolt home with both thumbs and didn't look back. Evelyn heard it, that small, final sound. And for 3 full seconds, she stood completely still, with a pan of cornbread in her hands, and the kitchen fire burning behind her, and the music already rising from the barn 30 yards away. Then she set the pan down, crossed to the door, pressed her palm flat against the wood, and pushed. It didn't move. She hit it once, hard. "Hello." Her voice came out level. "The door is bolted. Someone needs to open this door." The fiddle music swelled. Laughter followed it. Her voice went nowhere. If this story has ever made you feel something, if you have ever been made invisible in the place that was supposed to be your home, subscribe to this channel right now and follow every part of Evelyn's story to the very end. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because the man who's about to draw that bolt back is going to change everything. Red Willow, Montana Territory. The summer of 1874. Thomas Harper had built his ranch on land that didn't give itself easily, rocky bottom soil that took 3 years to break grass that came in thin. The first 2 seasons before it took hold and spread the way good grass does when it finally decides to trust the ground. He had fenced 300 acres of it. He had filled those acres with shorthorn cattle and hired men who knew what they were doing, and kept meticulous ledger books that told him year by year that he was building something that would last. What those ledger books did not tell him, what no ledger book could, was what was happening inside his own house. He had lost his first wife, Clara, when Evelyn was 7. The grief had restructured him from the inside out, the way a bad winter restructures a landscape, same ground underneath, but you wouldn't know it from looking. He had thrown himself into the ranch with the focused desperation of a man who needed every hour accounted for, and in doing so, he had slowly, without ever intending it, stopped accounting for his daughter. He had not meant to abandon Evelyn. That was the particular cruelty of it. He simply had not noticed he had. When Thomas married Beatrice Caldwell 4 years after Clara's death, Evelyn was 11. Beatrice had a daughter of her own, Rosalie, 2 years younger than Evelyn, with yellow hair and small china blue eyes, and a talent for appearing fragile at precisely the right moments. Every room Rosalie entered, someone reached for her hand. Every room Evelyn entered, someone handed her a task. Evelyn had been in the kitchen the morning after Beatrice and Rosalie moved their trunks into the Harper house, standing at the stove making biscuits, when Beatrice appeared in the doorway in her dressing gown with a cup of coffee in her hand, and looked around the kitchen with the unhurried attention of a woman taking inventory of something she had just acquired. "You're up early," Beatrice said. "I'm always up early," Evelyn said. "The fire needs building before." "Yes." Beatrice took a sip of coffee. "That's good. That's very good, Evelyn. A household runs on that kind of diligence." She said it warmly, almost maternally. "We're going to get along very well, I think." Evelyn was 11 years old, and she had wanted very much to believe that. She had believed it for almost 2 years, actually, because Beatrice was careful in the beginning. Careful and warm and strategic in a way that an 11-year-old girl who was desperate for a mother's attention could not have recognized for what it was. By the time Evelyn was 13, the shape of the thing had become visible. By 15, it had calcified into something she stopped trying to argue with. She woke before the sun. She built the kitchen fire. She hauled water-needed bread, fed the barn animals before the ranch hands arrived. No new dress when Rosalie received one. No seat at the table when guests visited. No introduction when Thomas's business partners came to the house. She was simply not present because she had learned that being present without being acknowledged was its own particular form of erasure, and she preferred the kitchen to that. She was 23 years old now, and she had grown into someone that the women of Red Willow had opinions about, and the men of Red Willow looked past in doorways. She was large and strong, built from 12 years of physical work, with wide shoulders and capable hands, and a body that carried its weight, the way good land carries water, holding it, using it, converting it into something that mattered. She was not what this territory called beautiful, and she had long since made her peace with the distance between herself and that word. What she had not made peace with, what she refused, on some bedrock level, she could not have articulated, but could not have denied either, was the idea that being looked past made her less worth seeing. She understood this ranch better than anyone in it. She tracked feed weights when shipments arrived because 3 years ago she had noticed the numbers didn't match the invoices. And she had been right. The supplier was shorting them by 4% per load consistently, and she had a written record going back 30 months. She knew the West pasture had been losing grass density for 3 seasons because the irrigation line was redirected in 1871, and nobody had tracked the downstream effects. She knew 2 of the bulls in the East herd needed replacing because their breeding quality was declining in ways that would show in next spring's calves if Thomas didn't act this fall. She had told him about the feed weights, once carefully choosing an evening when he seemed present and unhurried. He had looked up from his ledger and said, "Let Gus handle the supply questions, Evie. That's what I pay him for." Then he had looked back down. She had not told him about the pasture or the bulls. There was a limit to how many times you could offer information and be looked through before you stopped offering. So she kept her records. She kept her notes. She kept her knowledge folded inside herself like a letter written to no one because there was no one to send it to. And she kept working. Because the ranch needed the work whether anyone acknowledged it or not. And because work at least had the dignity of producing visible results, even when nobody traced those results back to the right source. Thomas had announced the celebration 5 weeks ago. I was hosting a gathering of the territory's most prominent ranching families, cattle buyers, landowners, men who controlled the water rights and the rail contracts and the political appointments that determined who thrived in Montana and who merely survived. It was framed as a social occasion because wealthy men preferred their business dealings dressed up that way, but the business was the point. And then Beatrice had seen Alexander Whitlock's name on the invitation list, and the entire household had shifted its center of gravity. Evelyn had learned about Alexander the same way she learned most things by listening from rooms she was not supposed to be in. Beatrice had discussed him with Rosalie for 3 evenings running at the parlor table, her voice carrying through the thin wall between the parlor and the kitchen, with the confidence of someone who did not consider the kitchen a space where consequential people existed. The Whitlock Ranch runs 20,000 acres along the Northern River Corridor, Beatrice told Rosalie. Cornelius Whitlock is stepping back. The son runs everything now. He's been running it 5 years, and he's better at it than his father was. A pause. He is 34. He was married. His wife died. He has not remarried. Is he kind? Rosalie asked. A brief silence that contained Beatrice's opinion of the question. He is wealthy, she said. And he is serious. Which means you will not flutter at him, Rosalie. He does not respond to flutter. He responds to composure. What does he look like? Like a man who works outdoors and doesn't apologize for it, Beatrice said. Which is fine, that's fine. You are not marrying his face. Evelyn had pressed her back against the kitchen wall and stared at the ceiling and thought about a man who had built something real and was right now being discussed as a target by a woman he had never met, for the benefit of a girl who was being prepared the way you prepare a lure shaped precisely to attract a specific thing. She had felt in that moment something she could not quite name. Not jealousy. Not for Rosalie's sake and certainly not for Alexander Whitlock's. Something more like a preemptive grief, the particular sorrow of watching something go wrong before it happens, when you're standing far enough to the side that no one will ask your opinion and close enough to see exactly how it ends. The dress arrived from the dressmaker 4 days later. Blue silk, the color of a clear morning sky, the finest fabric the town's dressmaker could source on short notice. Beatrice carried it into the house herself and called for Rosalie, and Evelyn listened from the hall to Rosalie's gasp and Beatrice's satisfied murmur, and then she went back to the kitchen because there was bread to bake and she was good at bread. 3 days before the gathering, Beatrice came to find her. Evelyn was at the kitchen table rolling pie dough 4 pies for the gathering cherry and apple, the kind of work that required attention and rewarded patience. She heard Beatrice's footsteps on the kitchen floor and did not look up. "You'll manage the outdoor kitchen the night of the gathering," Beatrice said. "I assumed I would. You'll ensure the food comes out correctly and on time. You will not enter the main house while guests are present." A pause. "You will not approach any guest. You will not attempt to insert yourself into the social occasion." Evelyn pressed the rolling pin forward. And if father asks where I am, your father will be occupied. Beatrice said it with the flat certainty of someone who had tested this prediction and found it reliable. I understand. Beatrice did not leave. Evelyn could feel her still standing there, and she kept rolling the dough, and the silence stretched the way silences do when someone has more to say and is deciding how to say it. Wear something practical, Beatrice said finally. Something appropriate to the work. I was going to wear the gray dress, Evelyn said. The cotton one. It's clean. No. Evelyn looked up. Beatrice's face was composed. It was always composed. That was one of the things Evelyn had spent years studying about her stepmother, the way her face never showed the machinery working underneath. The gray dress is too good for kitchen work. You'll wear what you normally wear. The work dress has a tear in the collar. Then it matches the work. Evelyn set the rolling pin down. She looked at Beatrice steadily. Is there something specific you're concerned about? Something moved behind Beatrice's eyes, quick, controlled, gone. I'm concerned about the food coming out on time and the kitchen running smoothly, that's all. She turned toward the door. Don't overthink it, Evelyn. She left. Evelyn picked up the rolling pin. She pressed it into the dough with slightly more force than the dough required. She was not stupid. She had not been stupid at 11, and she was not stupid now. She understood what Beatrice was doing, and she understood why, and the understanding sat in her chest with the particular weight of something she could not put down and could not carry comfortably. Beatrice was afraid of what happened when people looked at Evelyn. Not because looking at Evelyn produced disgust. Beatrice would have preferred that actually, because disgust was manageable. Beatrice was afraid because the people who took the time to actually look at Evelyn. The ranch hands. The women who brought their sick horses to the barn. The older men who wanted to understand the land. Those people did not look away again quickly. They found something there, something that held attention, and in a room full of men who valued competence, that was dangerous. The evening of the gathering arrived. Evelyn was in the outdoor kitchen by 4 o'clock, 2 hours before guests were due, because the timing on the food required it. She built the fire. She organized the serving dishes. She moved through the preparation with the precise, unhurried efficiency of someone who had been doing this kind of work for so long, it had stopped requiring conscious thought and become something closer to instinct. She heard the guests arrive in waves, the sound of horses and carriages on the road. Her father's expansive voice carrying from the front of the house, the general warm noise of people assembling for an occasion they were looking forward to. She heard the fiddle start up from the barn. She heard at some point a particular burst of Rosalie's laughter that was pitched just slightly higher than her natural laugh, the version she used when she was aware of being observed. Evelyn kept working, an hour into the gathering. When the first wave of food had gone out, and she was starting on the second she heard the kitchen door close. She turned. The room was unchanged. The fire was burning. The dishes were arranged. She crossed to the door and put her hand on it. Locked. She stood very still for 3 full seconds. Then she knocked. Once firm. Hello, the door is bolted. I need someone to open it. The fiddle kept playing. Laughter rose and fell from the direction of the barn. The night outside was warm and full of noise, and her voice was a small thing against all of it. She knocked again, harder this time with the heel of her hand. Hello. The door is... She stopped. Reset. Knocked a third time as hard as she could manage against thick pine wood. Someone has bolted this door. I need it opened right now. Nothing. She pressed her back against the wall and stood there with her arms at her sides and let herself feel it, all of it, for exactly the count of 10. The humiliation, the fury, the exhaustion of a person who has spent 12 years absorbing cruelty from someone she was supposed to call family, and who is now standing in a locked kitchen in a torn dress while music plays 30 yards away, and her father laughs somewhere in the middle of it, not knowing and not asking. 10 seconds. She gave herself 10 seconds. Then she pressed off the wall and started moving. She checked the window painted shut, swollen in the frame, not moving without tools. She checked the back wall for gaps in the planking, none wide enough. She looked at the door hinges, considered what she had available to work with, and concluded that her options were to wait or to make noise, and that making noise was more productive than waiting. She picked up an iron ladle and hit the door with it. The sound was considerably louder than her palm had been. She did it again, then again. "In here," she called, and her voice was not panicked because she did not allow it to be. But it was louder than she had spoken in years, louder than she normally permitted herself. "Someone is locked in the outdoor kitchen. I need this door opened." She hit the door twice more with the ladle. And then she heard footsteps, not from the direction of the barn, from the side of the house, moving in the way of someone who has stepped out for air, and heard something that didn't fit the evening. Slow, purposeful boots on packed earth. A pause outside the door. Then a voice low and clear. "Who's in there?" "Evelyn Harper," she said. "Thomas Harper's daughter. The door is bolted from outside." A silence of about 2 seconds. The kind of silence that a person produces when they are processing information that doesn't square with what they expected to find. Then, "Step back from the door, ma'am." She stepped back. The bolt moved. The door opened. The man in the frame was tall, wide through the shoulders, lean through the middle, with the build of someone who had not stopped doing physical work when the money started coming in. His coat was dark, and his shirt was clean, and his hat was in his hand, already removed before the door was open, which meant he had taken it off on the way to the door. Not after seeing her. Before. He looked at her directly. Not past her, not through her, not with the quick assessing scan of a man deciding whether she was worth the full attention. He looked at her the way you look at a person you intend to actually see. His eyes were dark brown. His face was weathered and angular and gave nothing away that he hadn't decided to give. "Who bolted this door?" he said. "I don't know who put the bolt across," Evelyn said. It was technically true. She had not seen Beatrice do it. "I've been working in here since before the guests arrived." "You work for the Harper family." "I am the Harper family," she said. "Thomas Harper is my father." He was still for a moment. Then something moved through his expression, brief, controlled, but there a man recalibrating against information that contradicted the picture he'd been given of this household. "Alexander Whitlock," he said. "I know who you are," Evelyn said. "Your family's name is on half the water rights agreements in northern Montana. I'm sorry you had to go looking for a door to open on a night when you should have been welcomed properly." He looked at her for a moment. Something in his expression shifted, not surprise exactly, but a species of attention that was different from what had been there before. More focused. "Thomas Harper's daughter," he said slowly, "was locked in the outdoor kitchen." "Yes." "During his own gathering." "Yes." He was quiet. The fiddle music from the barn was bright and insistent against the dark, and voices carried across the yard in waves, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, Beatrice Caldwell was managing her evening with flawless precision. And here was the one variable she had not managed. "Walk inside with me," Alexander said. He offered his arm slightly carefully in the manner of a man who understood the offer might not be wanted and was making it anyway, because not making it seemed worse. "I think you belong at this gathering." Evelyn looked at his arm. She looked at her dress torn at the collar, stained from the fire, the hem gray with ash. She looked at the direction of the barn. "I'm not dressed for a social occasion," she said. "No," he said. "You're dressed the way a woman looks when someone has taken her proper clothes away and locked her in a kitchen. That's not your doing. That's not your shame to carry." His voice was even. "And I think the people in that barn ought to look at it directly." The stillness that moved through her was complete. She had spent 12 years making herself smaller, quieter, less visible, less present, and she had become very good at it. And she did not know in this moment what to do with a man who had looked at the torn collar and the ash-stained apron and seen not someone who didn't matter, but the evidence of a wrong that needed witnesses. "All right," she said. Her voice came out steady. She had not been certain it would. She took his arm. They crossed the yard in the dark, and Alexander pulled open the barn door and walked through it with Evelyn Harper on his arm, and the fiddle did not stop immediately, because sound takes a moment to respond to shock. But faces turned. Conversations halted mid-sentence. The fiddle player's bow slipped, and the music dropped a full note, and then died. Rosalie's face went the color of fresh chalk. Beatrice went very still. The particular stillness of a woman running calculations at high speed. Her eyes moving from Evelyn's face to Alexander's arm to Evelyn's dress. To Alexander's expression, cycling through the data with the frantic efficiency of someone whose careful plan has just been walked through a barn door on the arm of the one person she hadn't planned for. Thomas Harper stood across the barn with a whiskey glass in his hand and 3 men he was trying to impress, and he turned with everyone else when the music stopped and he looked at his daughter in her kitchen dress with flour still on her hands. And what moved across his face was a collision of things that happened too fast to separate shock and confusion, and something that might have been shame if Thomas Harper had been the kind of man who processed shame quickly, and he was not. Alexander walked Evelyn to the center of the barn, where the lantern light was good, and he stopped, and he did not release her arm. He spoke without raising his voice, because a man who speaks quietly in a room that has gone silent is always heard more completely than a man who shouts. "Good evening. For those I haven't met, Alexander Whitlock." He paused one beat. "I've just come in from the outdoor kitchen, found the door bolted from outside." Another pause. The silence in the barn was absolute. Miss Evelyn Harper was inside it. Thomas Harper's daughter. He let it sit. "I thought she ought to be here." He said it plainly. The way a man says something that should not require saying, but clearly does. The old rancher, near the back wall, white side whiskers, 40 years of sun in his face, said, "Bolted." The word landed in the silence like a stone in still water. "I drew the bolt myself," Alexander said. Every head in the barn turned toward Thomas. Thomas set his whiskey glass down without noticing he'd done it. Beatrice said from somewhere to the left, in a voice of faultless concern. Evelyn was managing the outdoor kitchen. "The bolt on that door sticks. Sometimes she must have had trouble getting it open. I'm so sorry she caused a disruption." It was perfect. It was exactly the kind of response that works in rooms where no one is paying close attention. Alexander turned his head and looked at Beatrice for the first time since entering the barn. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was entirely neutral and somehow worse for it. "The bolt was fully across," he said. "Thrown and seated. She'd been calling for help for some time before I heard her." He paused. "A door that sticks gets unstuck eventually. A door that's been bolted stays bolted until someone on the outside decides to open it." He said it quietly. He said it without heat. He turned back to the room as though the matter was settled, which in the way that matters, it was. Beatrice said nothing. The silence that followed was the particular quality of silence that comes after something irreversible. After a window breaks after a name, is said that changes the shape of everything following it. Thomas Harper crossed the barn. He moved slowly through the crowd, and people made room for him without being asked, because the room understood that whatever was about to happen between Thomas Harper and his daughter was the most important thing happening in it right now. He stopped in front of Evelyn. He looked at her. He looked at the dress. He looked at her hands, still faintly marked with flour, because she hadn't had time to clean up properly before Alexander opened that door. "Evelyn," he said. His voice broke slightly on the second syllable. Just slightly, but Evelyn heard it. "Father," she said. She did not help him with what came next. She had been helping people manage their discomfort her entire life, absorbing their awkwardness, smoothing over the gaps, making herself smaller so others could be larger. She let this silence belong to Thomas. She let him carry it. He said, Were you in that kitchen the whole evening?" "Since 4 o'clock, she said. "I was preparing the food." "And the door was bolted," she said. "From outside, yes." Thomas looked at his daughter for a long moment. His face was doing something complicated and slow, the way a man's face looks when a realization is arriving that he doesn't want to receive, but cannot turn away from the recognition of something that has been true for a long time that he simply has not looked at directly. He said quietly for only her to hear, "I didn't know." Evelyn looked at her father. She thought about 12 years of meals cooked and records kept and feed weights checked and mornings before sunrise. She thought about the gray dress folded over Beatrice's arm, carried out of her room, like something confiscated. She thought about Gus Hannery's face when Thomas told him to focus on his own work, and the look Gus had given Evelyn afterward, the look of a man who wanted to say something and had decided against it for reasons of self-preservation. She said, I know you didn't. It was not forgiveness. It was not yet. It was something more the acknowledgement that a conversation was beginning that was too large for a barn full of witnesses on an evening when the fiddle player was still standing with his bow uncertain in his hand. Thomas nodded once slowly and stepped back. His eyes moved briefly to the edge of the barn where Beatrice was standing, and something in his expression changed. Not dramatically, not with the heat of public confrontation, but in the quiet, settled way of a man who has just revised a significant assumption. Alexander had stepped aside to give them space. When Evelyn turned, he was still there, unhurried, patient, hat in his hand. "You have guests," Evelyn said to him low enough that it was only his to hear. "I do," he said. "Men who came here to talk cattle with the Whitlock name." "They did. You should go talk to them." "I will," he said. "In a moment." He looked at her with the same direct attention that had startled her at the kitchen door. The quality of actual interest, not performed interest, not the socialized approximation of attentiveness that men produced when they were trying to make an impression. The real version. "I have a question first." "All right." "How long has the West pasture been underperforming?" She blinked. Of everything he might have said, this was not the thing she had assembled herself to receive. 3 seasons, she said. The irrigation line was redirected in 71. The grass density has been dropping since then. Nobody tracked the downstream effects. "Your father's foreman." "Gus knows," she said. "He told my father twice. My father told him to focus on his own work." Alexander absorbed this. "The feed supplier is shorting the weight by 4% per load," she said. "Consistently. I've been weighing shipments myself for 3 years. I have a written record." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite name, something between professional respect and something else, something less categorized, less businesslike. "Does your father know about the record?" "I told him about the feed weights once," she said. "He told me to let Gus handle the supply questions. And the bulls in the East herd." She looked at him sharply. "How do you know about the East herd bulls?" "I don't," he said. "But you just looked at me the way a person looks when a problem they've been carrying alone gets named out loud. So there's something about the East herd bulls." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Around them, the barn had resumed its noise, not fully, not with the same ease as before, but human beings are social animals, and a room full of them will pull toward normalcy even after the ground shifts. Conversations had restarted. The fiddle had found its note again. "2 of them need replacing," she said. "They've been overused. The breeding quality is declining. You'll see it in next spring's calf numbers if Thomas doesn't pull them this fall." "Has he been told?" "No." "Why not?" She looked at him directly. "Because the last time I brought him a problem, I was told to let the relevant person handle it. And the time before that. And the time before that." She paused. "At some point you stop bringing the problems and start keeping the records and hope that eventually someone reads them." Alexander was quiet for a long moment. Then he said carefully, as though measuring each word before he released it, "Miss Harper, who actually runs this ranch?" "My father runs this ranch." "Who watches the feed weights?" She said nothing. "Who tracks the pasture conditions? Who knows what the foreman told the owner and when? Who's going to know which bulls to pull this fall and which fields to rotate in spring?" The silence between them was different from the silence in the kitchen. Not the silence of a locked room, but the silence of something opening. "You can say it," Alexander said. His voice was quiet and completely without performance. "There's no one close enough to hear." Evelyn looked at him. She thought about 11 years old in a too small dress at a wedding supper watching a woman perform warmth. She thought about the gray dress carried out of her room. She thought about the kitchen door and the bolt and 30 years of someone deciding over and over that she did not need to be seen. "I do," she said, quietly, steadily. "I run this ranch, not on paper, not in the ledger books, but the things that actually keep it functioning, I do them. I've been doing them for years." Alexander nodded once, the way a person nods when they have just confirmed something they already knew. "Then," he said, "I need to speak with you. Not tonight. Tonight is not the right time for the conversation I want to have. But I would like to come back." She looked at him. To speak with my father about a business arrangement. To speak with the person who actually understands this operation, he said, which appears to be you. He paused. Your father can be present if that's more comfortable, but I'd like to know what you know. Evelyn held his gaze for a moment. Then something happened. Something small and quiet, and entirely internal, like a door opening in a room that had been shut for so long, the air inside had gone stale. Not hope, because hope was a thing she had trained herself to handle carefully. But something adjacent to it. Something that breathed. All right, she said. He nodded. He replaced his hat. Then he paused and said in the same level, unperformed voice, "For what it's worth, Miss Harper. The first time I saw you tonight, you were wearing a torn dress and standing in a locked kitchen with a ladle in your hand and flour on your face, and you spoke to me like a woman who had decided a long time ago that she was not going to apologize for being exactly who she is." She looked at him. "Don't stop doing that," he said. "Whatever comes next, don't stop doing that." He touched the brim of his hat and walked back toward the gathering, and Evelyn Harper stood in the middle of the barn, with the lantern light falling warm across her stained apron and her torn collar. And she breathed in slowly and breathed out, and she felt for the first time in longer than she could accurately calculate that the ground she was standing on was solid. Not because a man had told her she was worth something. She had always been worth something. That had always been true. It had been true every morning she built the fire before sunrise, and every evening she entered numbers into a ledger no one asked her to keep, and every time she weighed a feed shipment against an invoice and wrote down the 4% difference in careful, steady handwriting and put the paper away in a drawer. What was different tonight was this. Someone had walked into the room she'd been locked out of, and they had not needed to be told what they were looking at. They had simply looked, and they had seen. And Evelyn Harper, who had spent 12 years in this territory, being made invisible, was done being invisible. She was done. Evelyn did not sleep that night. She lay in her narrow bed and listened to the last guests leave, the sound of horses pulling away down the road, the creak of wagon wheels fading into the dark, her father's voice saying goodbye at the front of the house in the expansive tone that meant the evening had gone well by his measure. She heard Beatrice's footsteps in the hall. Precise. Controlled. Moving past Evelyn's door without pausing. She stared at the ceiling and thought about Alexander Whitlock's voice saying, "Don't stop doing that." And then she thought about the bolt on the kitchen door, and then she thought about her father's face when he looked at her flour-marked hands, and she understood that what had happened tonight was not an ending. It was the first movement of something considerably more complicated, and she needed to be clear-eyed about that before morning, because Beatrice was not finished. That was the central fact she needed to hold on to. A woman who had spent 12 years building an architecture of control. This Precise did not dismantle it in one evening, because a man from the Whitlock family walked through a barn door. She regrouped. She recalculated. She found a new angle. Evelyn knew this, the way she knew the feed weight discrepancies and the pasture drainage problem, not because anyone had told her, but because she had been paying attention for a very long time. She was up before 4. She had the kitchen fire built and the coffee on before the first ranch hand arrived, same as every morning, because the ranch did not pause for personal reckoning, and she had never expected it to. Gus Hannery came in at 5:30, the way he always did. Poured himself coffee without asking, because he had been doing it for 11 years and had long since stopped feeling the need to ask, and stood at the kitchen window, looking at the east pasture, the way a man looks at something he's worried about. "Hell of an evening," Gus said. "Yes," Evelyn said. "Whitlock boy opened that kitchen door himself. He did." Gus turned from the window and looked at her with the direct, unembroidered attention of a man who had watched this household for over a decade and had kept his own careful record of what he'd seen. "You all right?" "I'm fine, Gus." "Your father know how long you were in there?" "He knows now." Gus nodded slowly. He drank his coffee. He set the cup down and picked up his hat from the table and said without looking at her, "That Whitlock, he talked to some of the men last night after you'd gone in. Asked questions about the operation. Real questions. The kind a man asks when he actually wants to know the answers." Evelyn looked up from the stove. "What kind of questions?" "Feed supply, water rights on the south boundary, Breeding records going back 3 years. Gus paused. Asked Prentice about the West pasture. Prentice told him about the irrigation line. She went very still. Prentice told him. Prentice didn't know it was a sensitive subject, Gus said. He just answered the question. He looked at her now. Man knew what to ask Evelyn. That's what I'm telling you. He knew what questions to come in with. She turned this over in her mind. Alexander had asked her about the West pasture and the bulls and the feed weights last night. Asked her in the barn, minutes after meeting her in a conversation that should have been social and had become something else entirely. Which meant he had arrived at this gathering already knowing there were problems to find. He had come prepared to look. That was not the behavior of a man attending a social occasion. That was the behavior of a man conducting an assessment. "Thank you, Gus," she said. He put his hat on and went out the back, and Evelyn stood at the stove with the coffee bubbling and thought about what it meant that Alexander Whitlock had come to her father's gathering, not to be entertained, but to understand what he was actually looking at. She was still thinking about it when Beatrice walked into the kitchen at 7 o'clock. Beatrice was dressed. Fully, precisely dressed hair, arranged collar straight, the particular armor of a woman who had decided that the way to respond to last night was with absolute normalcy. She poured herself coffee. She sat at the kitchen table. She looked at Evelyn with an expression of measured pleasantness that Evelyn recognized as the most dangerous version of Beatrice's face. "Sit down," Beatrice said. "I have bread too. Sit down, Evelyn." She sat. Beatrice wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked at her stepdaughter with eyes that were entirely calm and entirely cold and entirely focused. "Last night was unfortunate," she said. "A misunderstanding about the kitchen door created an unnecessary scene. I want you to understand that if Alexander Whitlock comes back to this property, that scene is not to be referenced. Not by you, not to anyone." Evelyn looked at her. "A misunderstanding. The bolt sticks. I've said so. These things happen." Beatrice's voice was smooth as river water. "What matters now is managing the impression that was made. Mr. Whitlock is a serious man, and serious men move past social awkwardness quickly when given the right environment." "He didn't look like a man who thought it was social awkwardness," Evelyn said. Something moved behind Beatrice's eyes, quick and cold. "What he thought in the moment is less important than what he thinks going forward. And what he thinks going forward depends on what he encounters when he returns." She set her coffee cup down. "Rosalie will be available. Rosalie will be presented correctly. And you will be where you always are, managing the household work, and you will not seek him out." Evelyn said nothing. "Do you understand me?" "I understand you," Evelyn said. "I understood you last night too when you took my dress. I understood the message." Beatrice looked at her for a long moment. "Then we don't need to have this conversation again." "No," Evelyn said. "I don't think we do." Beatrice picked up her coffee and left. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table for exactly 30 seconds. Then she got up and went back to the bread because the bread needed to be done by 8, and she was running behind, and the ranch did not pause for any of this, and the bread would not make itself. Thomas Harper came to find her at 10 o'clock. She was in the barn, checking the East herd breeding records she kept in a separate ledger from the one Thomas used her own system, more detailed tracking things the official records didn't bother with. She heard his footsteps on the barn floor and did not look up because she had learned long ago that looking up too quickly gave people the impression that you had been waiting for them, and she had not been waiting for Thomas Harper. She had been working. He stopped a few feet away. "Evelyn." "Father." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him looking at the ledger in her hands, and she felt him notice what it was. Not the ranch's official ledger which lived in his desk, but something else, something he hadn't known existed. "What is that?" he said. "Breeding records," she said. "I've been keeping a parallel set for the East herd for 2 years. The official records don't track the individual bull performance over multiple seasons. Mine do." Thomas was very still. "I didn't know you kept records." "I know you didn't." She looked up at him then. His face was tired, not the tiredness of a bad night's sleep, but the deeper kind, The kind that comes from carrying something heavy in a direction you suddenly aren't sure is right. I've been keeping a lot of records. He pulled a hay bale over and sat on it, which surprised her. Thomas Harper did not sit on hay bales in barn aisles. He sat at his desk or in his chair in the parlor or at the head of the supper table. Sitting on a hay bale meant he had come here to talk and had decided somewhere between the house and the barn that he needed to set down the formality first. "Last night," he said. "You don't have to. Last night," he said again firmly, the way a man says something when he is determined to get through it regardless of how uncomfortable it is. "That door. Evelyn, who bolted that door?" She looked at him steadily. "I don't know who bolted it." "Don't protect her." The directness of it surprised her. She had prepared herself for careful questions, for plausible deniability, for Thomas's natural tendency to approach unpleasant truths, the way you approach a horse that might bolt slowly from the side with a lot of room to retreat. She had not prepared herself for him coming straight at it. "I didn't see who bolted it," she said, which was true. "But you know." She said nothing. Thomas leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and looked at the barn floor for a long moment. "How long?" he said quietly. "How long has this been? How long has it been this way?" Evelyn thought about how to answer that. She thought about the blue silk dress and the gray dress carried out of her room. She thought about the kitchen duties and the locked table during guest dinners, and the 12 years of careful incremental erasure that Beatrice had executed with such precision that Thomas had never had to be confronted with any single moment that was impossible to explain away. That was the genius of it. Actually, no single incident was undeniable on its own. It was only the accumulation that told the true story, and you only saw the accumulation if you had been paying attention to all of it. "A long time," she said finally. Thomas looked up at her. His eyes were red at the rims. "I failed you." It landed differently than she expected. She had imagined this conversation many times over the years, had constructed it in her head late at night when the house was quiet, and in every version she had imagined Thomas either defending himself or apologizing profusely, and she had prepared herself for both. She had not prepared herself for 3 flat words that did not defend or perform, that simply named the thing directly and accepted it. "Yes," she said. "You did." He nodded. He had expected that answer. He sat with it. "I want to fix it," he said. "I don't know. I don't know all of what needs fixing yet, but I want you to tell me. Whatever you've been carrying in this house that you shouldn't have had to carry alone, I want to know." Evelyn looked at her father for a long moment. She thought about how easy it would be to open the drawer in her mind where she had stored 12 years of grievances and simply hand the whole thing over to him. How much she had in her darker moments wanted exactly this, a father who asked, and she thought about Beatrice. Still in that house, still at that table, still in this moment drinking her morning coffee and calculating her next move with the focused efficiency of a woman who had been doing this for a very long time and had never once been stopped. "One thing at a time," she said carefully. "The ranch first, father. I need to show you the breeding records and the feed weight documentation. That's the most urgent." Thomas blinked. He had clearly come here expecting an emotional conversation and was being redirected into ranching logistics, and she watched him recalibrate. "The feed weights. The supplier is shorting us 4% per load," she said. "I've documented it for 30 months. At current volume, we're losing approximately $60 a month to that discrepancy. That's over $2,000 in documented losses." She held out the ledger. "It's all in here." Thomas took the ledger. He opened it. He looked at the first page, her precise handwriting column by column, date and shipment, and invoiced weight and actual weight, and the difference, and his face went through several changes in quick succession. Surprise first, then disbelief, then the particular expression of a man who is doing arithmetic in his head and arriving at a number he doesn't like. $2,000, he said. "At minimum. I may have missed some early loads before I started keeping records." "Why didn't you—" He stopped, heard himself, started again. "You tried to tell me. You told me to let Gus handle the supply questions." Thomas closed the ledger. He held it in both hands and was quiet for a moment, and she could see him understanding. Actually understanding. Maybe for the first time the specific shape of what he had done when he dismissed her. Not just to her, to himself, to the ranch. He had been paying $2,000 a year to not listen to his daughter. "I'll deal with the supplier today," he said. "There's more," she said. "The West pasture." "Gus told me about the West pasture." "Gus told you 2 years ago," she said. "And you told him to focus on his own work." Thomas looked at her. She held his gaze. She was not doing it to wound him, or rather she was not doing it only to wound him. She was doing it because the pattern needed naming before it could be broken, and Thomas needed to see the pattern clearly. "The irrigation needs to be rerouted back to the original line," she said. "It'll cost $200 in labor, and about 3 weeks of work if we start before the fall dry season. If we wait until next year, we'll lose another season of grass density, and the recovery time doubles." She paused. "And the 2 bulls in the East herd need to be pulled before the next breeding cycle. Their performance numbers are in the ledger." Thomas looked at the ledger in his hands. He looked at his daughter. He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice had a different quality than it had carried at the beginning of this conversation. Something heavier and more honest, stripped of the formality he usually wore, the way he wore his good coat. "How long have you known all of this?" he said. "The feed waits 3 years. The pasture 2 seasons. The bulls, I've been tracking them since last spring. And you've just been—" He stopped. "You've been carrying it." "I kept records," she said. "I didn't know what else to do with the information." Thomas Harper stood up from the hay bale. He straightened his coat with the automatic gesture of a man reassembling his dignity. But it was different this time, not the dignity of a man who felt he deserved it, but the more fragile dignity of a man who was trying to remember how to earn it. He held out the ledger. She didn't take it. "Keep it," she said. "You'll need it when you talk to the supplier." He looked at the ledger, then at her. Something in his expression cracked briefly at the edges, the careful composure of a man who had been holding something in for one night and one morning, slipping just slightly. "I'm sorry, Evelyn," he said. "I know that doesn't—" He stopped. "I know it doesn't cover the ground, but I'm sorry." She looked at her father. She thought about 7 years old, and Clara's eyes, and a wedding supper, and 12 years of 5 o'clock mornings. She thought about all of the moments that sorry could not retroactively fix. "I know you are," she said. And then, because it was true, even if it was not sufficient, "That matters, Father, it matters." He nodded. He left. She turned back to the barnwork and gave herself exactly 10 seconds to feel everything that conversation had moved in her. The relief and the grief and the complicated thing that lived between forgiveness and its absence. And then she folded it away and picked up where she had left off, because the East herd needed checking, and the afternoon water distribution needed managing, and Gus was going to need direction on the south boundary fence before the end of the week. The ranch did not pause. She did not pause. But she was aware with a clarity she had not possessed 24 hours ago that something had shifted in the ground beneath her feet. And she was aware that not everyone in this house was going to accept that shift without resistance. She found out how right she was at supper. Beatrice had set the table for 3. Thomas's place at the head, Beatrice's to his right, Rosalie's to his left. The same configuration as every family supper for 12 years, 3 places, which meant that the 4th chair, the one that had been Evelyn's mother's chair, once remained against the wall where Beatrice had moved it in the first month after the wedding, and where it had stayed ever since. Evelyn walked into the dining room, looked at the 3-place setting, and pulled the 4th chair to the table herself. She set it between Rosalie and her father's end, which put her directly across from Beatrice, and she sat down in it. The room went very quiet. Rosalie looked at her plate. Rosalie had been looking at plates and floors and windows and anything that was not directly in Evelyn's line of sight since last night, which Evelyn understood Rosalie was not an architect of cruelty. She was a product of it, shaped by her mother since childhood, into a particular kind of blindness, and whatever was happening now frightened her, because she did not have the architecture to process it. Beatrice looked at the 4th-place setting, then at Evelyn. Her face was flawless. "I didn't realize you'd be joining us tonight." "I live here," Evelyn said. "I'll be joining you every night." Thomas looked up from his end of the table. He looked at the 4th chair, at Evelyn sitting in it, and then at Beatrice. and something moved across his face that was not quite the confrontation Evelyn needed from him, but was not the old familiar abdication either. He said, "Pass the bread, would you, Beatrice?" and picked up his fork. It was not heroic. It was not the moment where Thomas Harper stood up and named every wrong and demanded accounting. It was a man picking up his fork and asking for the bread, which meant he was not going to ask Evelyn to move the chair, which was for tonight enough. Beatrice passed the bread. Her face remained composed. Her eyes briefly found Evelyn's across the table, and what was in them was not anger. Anger was too simple. It was recalculation. The specific look of a person who has registered that the territory has changed and is already mapping the new landscape. Evelyn held her gaze and reached for the bread. Dinner was quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of a family at ease with each other, but the taut quiet of four people managing around a tension that nobody named aloud. Rosalie ate quickly and asked to be excused before dessert. Thomas discussed the south boundary fence with careful neutrality. Beatrice spoke twice, once about the weather, and once about a social call she intended to make in town on Thursday, and both times her voice was perfectly modulated and gave nothing away. When Thomas left the table and Beatrice rose to go to the parlor, she paused behind Evelyn's chair. She did not touch her. She did not lower her voice. She said pleasantly, "I hope you slept well last night, Evelyn. You looked tired." "I slept fine," Evelyn said. "Good." Beatrice moved toward the parlor. "You'll want to be well rested. I imagine the next few days will be busy." She said it warmly. She said it the way you say something to a person you are fond of, something caring and unremarkable. And she said it in a tone that made Evelyn's spine go straight, because Beatrice only used that tone when she had already decided what she was going to do next, and was satisfied with the plan. Evelyn cleared the table alone the way she always had, and thought about what Beatrice's next move looked like. She was still thinking about it 2 days later when Alexander Whitlock rode back up the Harper Ranch Road. She saw him from the barn before he reached the house, heard the horse first actually, and knew it wasn't one of theirs from the gate, and came to the barn door and watched him come up the road in the late afternoon light. He rode the way men who had grown up on horseback rode, without thinking about it, easy and straight, the horse moving well under him. He had not sent word ahead. That was the first thing she noticed. He had simply come. He saw her at the barn door and turned the horse toward her, rather than toward the house, which was the second thing she noticed. The house was where Beatrice was. The barn was where Evelyn was. He came to the barn. "Miss Harper," he said, pulling up and dismounting with the same unhurried efficiency he seemed to apply to everything. "Mr. Whitlock." She looked at him. "You didn't send word." "No," he said. He was not apologetic about it. "I wanted to come back before anyone had time to arrange what I was going to see." She looked at him for a moment. "That's a direct thing to say." "I'm a direct man." He looped the reins over the fence post beside the barn door. "Is your father here?" "He's in the south pasture with Gus. He'll be back before dark." Alexander nodded. He looked at the barn, then at her. "Would you show me the east herd while we wait?" They walked the east pasture for the better part of an hour, Evelyn pointing out the bulls she'd flagged in her records, explaining the specific breeding data, walking him through the calf quality decline she had been tracking. He listened the way he had listened in the barn 2 nights ago, fully, without the restless energy of a man waiting for his turn to speak. He asked precise questions. He challenged 2 of her conclusions, not dismissively, but with the specific objections of someone who had his own data to weigh against hers, and she defended her reasoning with the calm certainty of someone who had been sitting with this information for long enough to know it thoroughly. "You're right about the bulls," he said, after she had walked him through the 3rd season's numbers. "Pull them both before October." "I know," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "You didn't need my confirmation." "No," she said. "But it's useful to have it." He looked at the east herd for a moment. The cattle moved slowly in the afternoon heat, unbothered, doing what cattle do. "Your father is going to need to make some changes quickly if he wants this operation to be worth what he thinks it's worth," he said. "The feed supplier issue alone has been compounding for years." "I know that too." "Does he know you know?" "We talked," she said. 2 days ago. He's dealing with the feed supplier this week." Alexander looked at her. And the rest of it? She was quiet for a moment. One thing at a time. He studied her face not intrusively, but with the focused attention she was beginning to recognize as simply how he looked at things he was trying to understand. "You're protecting him," he said. "Even now." "I'm pacing it," she said. "There's a difference. If I hand Thomas Harper 12 years of accumulated problems, all at once he shuts down. He's always been that way. You give him one real thing to fix, and he fixes it well. You give him 10 things, and he goes back to his ledger books and decides the problem is too large to approach." Alexander was quiet for a moment. "You've managed him." "I've worked around him," she said. "It's not the same thing." "No," he said. "I suppose it isn't." He turned back toward the barn, and she fell into step beside him. "I want to talk to him about a water rights arrangement. The south boundary of your property runs adjacent to a tributary that connects to the Whitlock Northern Corridor. If we negotiated a shared usage agreement, it would benefit both operations, but I need to know the Harper Ranch is a stable enough operation to be a reliable partner." She understood what he was saying. "You're assessing us." "I've been assessing you since before I arrived the other night," he said. "I'd heard things about the Harper operation, good things historically. But the numbers I was seeing in the regional reports didn't match the reputation. I wanted to understand the gap." "And do you," she asked, "understand it?" He looked at her directly. "I understand that the gap between what this ranch is and what it could be is currently occupied by one person who has been doing the work of 3 without acknowledgement, authority, or support." He paused. "Yes, I understand the gap." She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. She said carefully, "You need to be clear with me, Mr. Whitlock, about what you're here for. If you're here for the water rights arrangement, that's a conversation with my father. If you're here to assess the operational condition of this ranch, you've done that. If you're here for something else—" She stopped. "I'm here for all 3, he said, "and I'm not going to pretend otherwise." She looked at him. The afternoon light was long and warm, and the east herd moved behind them, and somewhere across the ranch, a horse was calling to another horse the way horses do when the day begins to cool. "That's a direct thing to say," she said. The same words she'd used before, but different now, lighter, less guarded. "I'm a direct man," he said. The same answer. They stood there for a moment, in the way that 2 people stand when they have arrived at the edge of something and are both aware of it, and neither one is quite ready to step off. Then the sound of a horse on the road broke the moment. Thomas coming back from the south pasture with Gus behind him, the familiar rhythm of the Harper Ranch reasserting itself over everything the way it always did. Alexander touched the brim of his hat and turned toward the approaching riders. Evelyn fell into step beside him, and they walked together toward the front of the property, and she was aware of how they must have looked from a distance walking side by side out of the east pasture in the long afternoon light, and she was aware more acutely that someone in the front parlor window was watching. She did not look toward the window. She did not need to. She already knew what Beatrice's face looked like when it was doing that kind of watching. She had been looking at that face for 12 years. She knew every expression in its repertoire. What she had not known until the last 48 hours was that she no longer needed to arrange her life around it. Thomas swung down from his horse and took in the scene before him with the recalibrated attention of a man who was trying to see things he had previously chosen not to look at. He looked at Alexander. He looked at Evelyn beside him. He looked at the direction of the east pasture behind them. He was doing arithmetic, not the financial kind, but the human kind, the kind where you add up what you're seeing and try to arrive at an honest sum. "Whitlock," he said. He extended his hand. "Harper." Alexander shook it. "Thank you for having me the other night, and for letting me come back." "I should have written," Thomas said. "I planned to write, to apologize for the circumstances of the other evening." "No need," Alexander said, and he said it simply without the elaborate social absolution that would have let Thomas off too easily. "What I'd like is to sit down with you about the south boundary water rights. I think there's an arrangement here that benefits both operations. But I want to understand the Harper Ranch's current situation clearly before I propose anything." Thomas glanced at Evelyn. "I think my daughter can help you with that," he said. "She knows this operation better than I do." He said it plainly and without shame, and it was possibly the most honest thing Evelyn had heard her father say in 12 years, and it cost him something to say it, and he said it anyway. Alexander looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at her father. "All right," she said. "Let's go inside." The three of them walked toward the house, and the front door opened before they reached it, because Beatrice had been watching from the window and had calculated exactly how long it would take them to cross the yard, and she was standing in the doorway when they arrived, composed, welcoming the perfect image of a gracious ranch wife receiving an honored guest. "Mr. Whitlock," she said with a warm smile that reached her eyes because she had always been able to make it reach her eyes when she needed it to. "What a lovely surprise. We're so pleased to have you back." "Ma'am," Alexander said. He touched his hat. He looked at Beatrice with the same direct, unrevealing expression he applied to most things. Beatrice's smile did not waver. She stepped back from the door in the gesture of welcome, and as Evelyn moved to pass her, Beatrice said lightly, pleasantly, the way you'd say something to someone you cared about. "Evelyn, you must be exhausted from the afternoon work. Why don't you get cleaned up and I'll arrange the coffee?" It was perfectly done. It implied Evelyn was dirty. It implied her presence in the meeting was unnecessary. It offered her an exit that sounded like consideration. Evelyn stopped. She looked at Beatrice. She said quietly and clearly, "I'll get cleaned up and join you in the sitting room, thank you." She looked at Alexander. 5 minutes. She walked past Beatrice into the house. Behind her she heard Alexander say to no one in particular, "I'll wait," and the particular quality of those two words, patient, unhurried, and completely certain, settled in her chest like something solid. She washed her hands. She changed her shirt. She was back in the sitting room in 4 minutes because she had said 5, and she did not need to use all 5, and she sat in the chair across from her father's desk and looked at Beatrice standing in the doorway with the coffee tray and said, "Thank you, Beatrice," in the same pleasant, measured tone that Beatrice had been using on her for 12 years. Beatrice set the coffee tray on the side table. Her face was entirely composed. Her eyes were doing the recalculating thing. She said, "I'll leave you to your business," and withdrew from the room with the controlled grace of a woman who knew how to retreat without appearing to retreat. Thomas poured the coffee. Alexander settled into the chair across from the desk. Evelyn opened the ledger she had brought in from the barn. And the work began. What happened in that sitting room over the next 2 hours was on its surface a business conversation: water rights, breeding records, feed supply contracts, pasture rotation schedules, the financial projections for the south boundary arrangement that Alexander had been considering for the better part of a year. Thomas asked questions. Alexander answered them and asked his own, and both men were smart enough and experienced enough to conduct a serious negotiation with the seriousness it required. But underneath the business conversation, something else was happening. Something quieter and more structural. Every time a question arose that Thomas could not answer from memory, he looked at Evelyn, and Evelyn answered it. And Alexander absorbed her answer and directed his follow-up question back to her and the follow-up after that. And within 40 minutes, the negotiation had quietly reorganized itself around Evelyn's knowledge of the Harper Ranch in a way that was too natural and too gradual to be called a takeover, but was functionally exactly that. Thomas noticed. She could see him noticing the slight shift in his posture, the way he listened to her answers with an attention. He was not performing, actually following what she said, and updating his own understanding against it. He did not appear diminished by it. He appeared in a way she had not expected, relieved, as though he had been carrying something heavy for a long time, and someone had quietly taken part of the load without making him ask. By the time the coffee was finished, and Alexander had accepted the outline of an arrangement that would take another month of negotiation to formalize, the evening was dark outside the sitting room windows. Thomas walked Alexander to the door. Evelyn hung back, gathering the ledgers. She heard Alexander's voice in the entryway saying something to Thomas in a low tone that she could not make out. She heard Thomas respond. Then the front door and the sound of a horse, and then Thomas coming back through the hall. He paused in the sitting room doorway. "He wants to come back Thursday," he said, "to finalize the water rights terms." "I know," Evelyn said. "He told me." Thomas was quiet for a moment. He wants you there. I know that too. Thomas leaned against the doorframe. He looked at his daughter with the look of a man who has spent a long afternoon watching something he should have seen years ago, and who is trying to figure out what to do with this specific grief of realizing he is 12 years late to it. You should have been in every conversation, he said. Every business meeting, every negotiation, for years. I should have... He stopped. He looked at the floor. I wasted your knowledge, Evelyn. I wasted your... He stopped again. She let him stop. She did not fill the silence for him. I'm going to fix that, he said. Starting Thursday. You'll be in every meeting going forward. Your name goes on the operational correspondence. He looked up. I should have done it long ago. Evelyn looked at her father. She thought about 12 years and $2,000 in feed discrepancies, and a pasture losing grass for 3 seasons, and bulls that needed pulling, and a gray dress carried out of her room. Yes, she said. You should have. She picked up the ledgers. She walked past him toward the hall, and she heard him say her name once quietly, and she paused. That record you've been keeping, Thomas said. The feed weights, the pasture data, the breeding records. He paused. All of it. How long did it take you to build all of that? She considered. 3 years for the most detailed parts. The rest I've been tracking in one form or another since I was 16. Thomas closed his eyes briefly. 7 years, he said. 7 years of records I never asked to see. 8, she said. Some of it goes back further. She walked down the hall to the kitchen. She set the ledgers on the table. She put the kettle on because the evening had gone cold, and she wanted tea, and she stood at the stove and listened to the quiet of the house, and thought about Thursday. She was thinking about Thursday, and the water rights arrangement, and the east herd, and the pasture irrigation, and 17 other things that needed attention, when she heard a sound from the hallway outside the kitchen. Not footsteps, but the specific sound of someone standing still. She did not turn around. Beatrice, she said. A pause. Then Beatrice walked into the kitchen and stood near the door with her arms at her sides and her face completely composed and her eyes doing the careful, efficient calculation that Evelyn had been reading for 12 years. He'll lose interest, Beatrice said. No preamble, no warmth. The warm tone was gone, and what was underneath it was something Evelyn had rarely heard from Beatrice directly. Not anger, but a cold, focused certainty. Men like Alexander Whitlock don't attach themselves to women like you, Evelyn. Not permanently. He's interested in the ranch, in the water rights. That's what he came here for, and when he has what he needs from your father's operation, he'll be gone. Evelyn poured hot water into her cup. She did not hurry. She set the kettle down and picked up the cup and turned and looked at her stepmother. You might be right, she said. Beatrice blinked. She had not expected that. You might be entirely right, Evelyn said. He might be here for the ranch. He might get what he needs from the water rights arrangement and move on. She held Beatrice's gaze. But you know what's different now, Beatrice? Whether he stays or goes. I'm still here. I'm in the meetings. My name is going on the operational correspondence. My father knows what I know. She paused. You locked me in a kitchen, and it didn't work. What you built took 12 years, and it came apart in one evening. She picked up her tea. Whatever you're planning next, I want you to think about that. Beatrice looked at her. Her face was still composed. Something moved behind her eyes, deep, cold, and very fast. She said nothing. She turned and walked out of the kitchen, and Evelyn listened to her footsteps go down the hall and up the stairs, precise and controlled all the way to the top. Evelyn drank her tea. She was not foolish enough to think this was over. A woman who had operated with Beatrice's precision for 12 years did not walk away from a single evening's reversal and accept the new landscape. She was regrouping. She was finding the new angle. Whatever came next was already being planned. But for the first time in 12 years, Evelyn Harper was not standing in it alone. And that she was beginning to understand changed everything about what came next. Thursday came in fast and cold, the way August mornings sometimes do in Montana when the season is thinking about turning, and Evelyn was up at 4, the way she always was. Fire-built coffee on the ranch machinery of her daily life, running the same as it had run for 12 years, regardless of what was happening inside the walls of this house. But something was different. She felt it in the way she moved through the kitchen, not faster, not slower, but with a quality of attention that was sharper than usual. The way you move when you know someone is watching, and you have decided deliberately that the watching is not going to change anything about how you move. Beatrice had been quiet for 3 days. That was the thing that kept pulling at the edge of Evelyn's attention, the way a loose thread pulls at the edge of a garment, not causing damage yet, but promising to, if you kept pulling. Beatrice quiet was not Beatrice at peace. Beatrice quiet was Beatrice working. Gus came in at 5:30. He poured his coffee. He said without preamble, "Someone was in the barn last night." Evelyn turned from the stove. "Which barn?" "East. I found the breeding ledger on the floor this morning. The one you keep separate from the ranch records." He looked at her over his coffee cup. "It was on the floor, Evelyn. Not fallen. Set down. Someone had it open and set it on the floor when they were done with it." She was very still. "Was anything missing?" "Not missing. But the pages for August and September last year, I could see where they'd been pressed flat. Like someone put them face down on something and pressed." He paused. "Like someone was copying them." Evelyn set her own cup down carefully. She thought about Beatrice's face in the kitchen 3 nights ago. The thing that had moved behind her eyes deep cold and very fast. The absolute composure of a woman who had already decided what she was going to do next. "Thank you, Gus," she said. "You want me to?" "No," she said. "Thank you. I'll handle it." Gus looked at her for a moment, with the look of a man who has watched this household for 11 years and has a very clear opinion about what needs handling and by whom. He did not say the opinion aloud. He put on his hat and went out, which was the most useful thing he could do. Evelyn stood at the stove and thought. The breeding records for August and September of last year were the months she had documented the clearest evidence of the East Bulls' declining performance. Specific numbers, specific dates, specific comparisons against the prior season. In isolation, those records would mean nothing to most people. But in the hands of someone who knew how to use them, someone who could take them to the feed supplier, or to a lawyer, or to anyone with a stake in undermining Evelyn's credibility as a ranch manager, they became something else. They became the raw material for a counter-narrative. A way of saying, look at these numbers, look at these records, look at how wrong she's been, look at why you shouldn't listen to her. Beatrice did not need the information to be accurate. She needed it to create confusion. Confusion was enough. Evelyn went to the barn. She retrieved her ledger from the floor where Gus had described it, checked the August and September pages, and confirmed what he had told her. The faint residue of pressure on the paper. The slight displacement of the pages from where she always kept them. She took the ledger to the house, went to her room, and put it in the locked chest at the bottom of her wardrobe. Then she came back to the kitchen and finished making breakfast. She did not say anything to Thomas. Not yet. One thing at a time, and the most urgent one thing right now, was Alexander arriving at 2 o'clock and the water rights meeting going the way it needed to go. Everything else had to wait behind that. Alexander arrived at 5 minutes before 2, which told her something about him that she filed away alongside the other things she was accumulating, that he was a man who came early rather than late, which meant he was a man who wanted to be in a room before the situation arranged itself around him, rather than arriving into an arrangement someone else had made. Thomas met him at the door. Evelyn was already in the sitting room with the ledgers and her notes from the South Boundary Survey she had done herself 3 years ago, when she had suspected the water situation was more complicated than Thomas's official record suggested. It was. The tributary that ran along the south edge of Harperland did not behave the way the county map said it behaved. It ran seasonal variations that the map had not accounted for, and she had documented 2 years of those variations in a notebook that she had never shown anyone. She showed it to Alexander within the first 15 minutes of the meeting. He looked at it. He looked at it for a long time, the kind of looking that is actually reading, careful and complete, not scanning. Then he looked up at her. "You surveyed this yourself." 3 years ago, she said. "I thought the county map was wrong. I walked the boundary and tracked the water levels through spring runoff and summer dry season and documented what I found." "The county map is wrong," he said. He looked at the notebook again. There's a seasonal backflow here. He pointed to a specific entry, July of 1872. This changes the terms of the arrangement I was proposing, significantly. I know. No, she said. That's why I showed it to you first. Thomas was watching this exchange with the careful, recalibrated attention he had been applying to his daughter for 3 days now. The attention of a man who is discovering late the actual dimensions of something he thought he already knew. He said, "How does it change the terms?" "The water sharing I was proposing assumed consistent flow in the dry season," Alexander said. "Based on this." He held up Evelyn's notebook. "The Harper South boundary actually has priority claim on the tributary during the critical August window because of this backflow pattern. If we'd drawn the agreement based on the county map, your father would have been giving up rights he didn't know he had." Thomas looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him steadily. "I was going to bring it up," she said. "I wanted you to have the full picture." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "You were." He looked at the ceiling briefly, and she could see him doing the specific arithmetic of a man counting up the cost of 12 years of not asking his daughter what she knew. "I see that." The meeting went another hour and a half. They worked through the water rights framework line by line, Evelyn catching 2 additional discrepancies between Alexander's proposed terms and the actual conditions on the south boundary. Alexander revising the framework each time with the clean efficiency of a man who preferred accuracy over pride of authorship. By the time they were finished, the arrangement they had outlined was significantly different from what Alexander had arrived with, more equitable, more specific, and considerably more protective of the Harper Ranch's actual interests. When Thomas went to pour more coffee, Alexander looked at Evelyn across the desk. He said quietly, "You could have let me keep the original terms." "Yes," she said. "Most people would have." "I know," she said. "That's why most people end up in arrangements that don't serve them." He looked at her for a moment with that focused, unrevealing attention that she was beginning to read more fluently than she had 3 days ago. "Why didn't you?" She met his gaze. "Because a good arrangement has to work for both sides to last," she said. "I want this to last." Something shifted in his expression. A small thing, a very controlled thing, but she caught it. "So do I," he said. Thomas came back with the coffee, and the moment folded back into business, and they spent another 20 minutes on the timeline for formalizing the agreement. When Alexander finally stood to leave, he shook Thomas's hand and then turned to Evelyn and said with the same directness he brought to everything, "I'll need your signature on the final agreement as well, as the operational manager of record." Thomas blinked. "Evelyn isn't." "She should be," Alexander said. Not harshly, simply. The way a man states a fact that he considers beyond reasonable dispute. The survey data, the breeding records, the feed weight documentation, the pasture tracking. That's the operational knowledge this ranch runs on. The person who holds that knowledge should hold the operational title. He looked at Thomas. "I'm not going to formalize a water rights agreement with someone who has incomplete information about the property. Miss Harper has the complete information." The silence in the sitting room was the particular quality of a silence that changes something. Thomas looked at his daughter. Evelyn looked at her father, and she kept her face very still, because she understood that this moment required Thomas to arrive at the conclusion himself, that if she pushed, he would feel pushed, and if she was patient, he would find his own way to it. Thomas said slowly, "Evelyn, would you—" He stopped, tried again. "I'd like to list you as the operational co-manager of the Harper Ranch. On the formal documents. Starting with this agreement." He paused. "If you're willing, if you're—" She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the ledger on the barn floor. She thought about Beatrice's face in the kitchen. She thought about what it meant to have her name on a document. A legal document, a piece of paper that said she was here, and she was real, and she mattered to the functioning of this operation. "Yes," she said. "I'm willing." Alexander touched the brim of his hat. He walked to the door. Thomas walked him out, and Evelyn sat in the sitting room chair for a moment, with her hands in her lap, and the notebooks and ledgers stacked around her, and the afternoon light coming in through the window, and she breathed. She did not let herself feel it all at once. She parceled it out carefully, the way you parcel out water in dry season, just enough to get through the next stretch, not so much that you forget there's more dry ahead, because there was more dry ahead. She could feel it. She felt it confirmed at supper when Beatrice did not come to the table. Thomas noticed first. He said, "Where is Beatrice?" And the question was neutral on the surface, and not neutral underneath. Rosalie said without looking up from her plate. "She had a headache. She's resting." Evelyn said nothing. She ate her supper. She thought about the ledger pages pressed flat in the barn. After supper, she was washing dishes when Rosalie appeared in the kitchen doorway, not with the purposeful entry of someone who had something to say, but with the uncertain hovering of someone who wanted to say something and hadn't decided yet if they were going to. "Rosalie," Evelyn said, "come in or go out, but don't stand in the doorway." Rosalie came in. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands folded and looked at them and said to her hands, "She's not sick." "I know," Evelyn said. "She's writing letters." Rosalie's voice was very quiet. "She was writing them all afternoon, before the meeting, during it. She asked me to take 2 of them to the post this evening." Evelyn set down the dish she was drying. She turned. "Did you take them?" Rosalie looked up. Her face was the face of someone who had been built piece by piece to do what her mother said, and who is only now beginning to feel the weight of the structure she's been living inside. "No," she said. "I said I would, and then I didn't." "Where are they?" Rosalie reached into her pocket and produced 2 sealed envelopes. She set them on the kitchen table. She looked at them and then at Evelyn with eyes that held something complicated, not quite guilt, not quite courage, something in the territory between. Evelyn looked at the envelopes. She did not touch them. "Who are they addressed to?" Rosalie swallowed. "One to the county land office. One to a lawyer in Helena." She paused. "I didn't read them, but I heard her talking to herself while she wrote, the way she does when she's working something out." She stopped. "She said your name, and she said falsified, and she said incompetence." The kitchen was very quiet. Evelyn picked up the envelopes. She looked at the addresses. Rosalie had described them accurately. She set them back down. She looked at her half-sister, who was 21 years old and had spent her entire life as an instrument of her mother's planning, and was sitting at this table right now because she had made a choice that was in the specific geography of this household, an act of genuine courage. "Thank you," Evelyn said. "Rosalie, thank you." Rosalie nodded. She looked back at her hands. I'm not... She started again. "I'm not like her. I know you probably think I am, but I don't want to be." "I know you don't," Evelyn said. And she meant it. Rosalie got up from the table and went to the door and then paused. "She has copies," she said. "I think she made copies before she sealed them. Whatever's in them, she has copies." Then she was gone, and Evelyn stood in the kitchen with 2 sealed envelopes on the table and the dish towel still in her hand, and she understood that the quiet 3 days were over. She took the envelopes to her room. She opened them carefully with a thin knife, the way her mother had taught her when she was small, a skill she had thought was useless for years and was now profoundly grateful for. She read them both. Twice. Beatrice had written to the county land office claiming that the Harper Ranch operational records had been falsified by an unauthorized party, an unnamed household member, who had been keeping parallel documentation outside the official record-keeping system. She framed it as a concern about the ranch's legal standing and requested a formal review of the ranch's records before any new agreements were executed. The letter to the lawyer in Helena was more specific. It outlined a claim that Evelyn Harper had been misrepresenting herself to outside parties as a ranch manager with authority. She did not legally possess potentially invalidating agreements made on that basis. It referenced the water rights discussion with the Whitlock family specifically. It asked whether there were grounds for intervention. Evelyn read both letters a 3rd time. Then she set them on her desk and sat very still for a long moment, and she let herself feel the specific quality of this, the cold, focused intelligence of it, the years of practice behind it, the way Beatrice had identified exactly the right pressure point and pressed it with exactly enough force to create maximum disruption without appearing vindictive. The letters were not angry. They were concerned. That was the most dangerous thing about them. She thought about Rosalie at the kitchen table. I think she made copies. She picked up her ledger. She picked up the water survey notebook. She picked up 30 months of feed weight records. She sat at her desk and went through every piece of documentation she had page by page, and thought about what Beatrice's letters needed to be able to demonstrate, and whether her records provided a defense against it. They did. They did clearly and completely, if read by someone who was looking for the truth. The problem was that the county land office and a lawyer in Helena were not necessarily looking for the truth. They were responding to a complaint. And complaints created presumptions, and presumptions required effort to overcome. She needed to get to Alexander before the letters did. She was at his hotel in Red Willow by 7 the next morning. She had been on horseback since 5:30 in the pre-dawn cold, riding the 3 miles to town with her documentation saddlebag across the pommel and her mind running through every possible version of the conversation she was about to have. She did not have to explain why she was there. He opened the hotel door and looked at her face and said, "Come in," and that was all. She told him everything. The ledger on the barn floor, Rosalie's envelopes, the letters and what was in them. She set her documentation on the small table in his hotel room and walked him through every piece of it, not frantically, not with the urgency of someone who needed saving, but with the methodical precision of someone presenting a case and trusting the other person to evaluate it fairly. He listened. He asked 2 questions. He read both letters and set them down and was quiet for a moment. "She's smart," he said finally. "Yes," Evelyn said. "She is." "The land office complaint creates a procedural problem even if it goes nowhere," he said. "It flags our agreement as disputed before it's formalized. That's a delay of months potentially. My legal team will have to respond." He looked at her. "Which she knows." "Yes." "And the Helena lawyer is almost certainly someone she already has a relationship with," Evelyn said. "Beatrice doesn't write cold letters. She writes to people she's prepared in advance." Alexander was quiet again. He stood up and went to the window and looked out at Red Willow's main street in the early morning light, and she watched his back and thought about the fact that she had ridden 3 miles in the dark to come here, and that she was not sure even now how he was going to respond to all of this. She said, "I want to be clear about something." He turned. "I did not come here for you to solve this," she said. "I came here because you needed to know about the land office letter before it arrived, because it affects the agreement, and you have a right to that information." She held his gaze. "I can handle Beatrice. I've been handling her for 12 years. I know her methods, and I know her weaknesses, and I have the documentation to refute every specific claim in those letters." She paused. "But I need you to know what's coming." He looked at her for a long moment. "What are her weaknesses?" She almost smiled. "She relies on the fact that no one compares her accounts to each other. Every story she tells is internally consistent, but if you put all of them together in the same room, they don't match." She paused. "She told Thomas I was stealing from the household accounts 2 years ago. She told Gus I had mismanaged the East herd breeding records. She told the feed supplier I had been unauthorized to inspect the shipments." She let that sit. None of those accounts can coexist with each other. If she was stealing, she wouldn't have access to the breeding records to mismanage. If I was unauthorized to inspect shipments, why would I have access to the household accounts? She builds each story for a separate audience and counts on those audiences never talking to each other. Alexander was very still. "Do they? They never have before," she said. "I'm going to make sure they do now." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You came here to tell me what's coming. But there's something else." She looked at him. "You came here because you needed one person to know the whole picture before everything gets complicated," he said. "Someone who has access to the documentation and the people involved, and who knows you well enough to recognize the truth when the alternative is being presented." He looked at her directly. "You needed a witness." She sang for a moment. Then, "Yes." "You have one," he said. The simplicity of it hit her somewhere she had not prepared for. She had prepared for negotiation, for doubt, for the careful hedging of a man protecting his business interests. She had not prepared for 2 words said with the complete, unhurried certainty of someone who had made a decision and was not interested in revisiting it. She said, "The letters will probably arrive at the land office by Monday." "Then we have until Monday," he said. "Sit down, Miss Harper. Let's go through all of it." They spent 3 hours at that small hotel table. Evelyn's documentation spread between them. Alexander's own records of the water rights discussion laid alongside it. The 2 letters from Beatrice weighed against everything else. He sent a wire to his lawyer in Helena before 10 o'clock flagging the situation before Beatrice's letter could arrive and frame it first. He wrote a letter to the county land office himself, establishing the formal basis of the water rights discussion and Evelyn's documented role in it, signed with the Whitlock name. When they were done, Evelyn gathered her papers. She stood. She said, "Thank you." "Don't thank me," he said. "This is the right thing. That's all." She was at the door when he said, "Evelyn." She stopped. He had used her name, her first name, without the miss, and it landed differently than she had expected, closer and warmer, like a hand extended in a way that required a decision about whether you were going to take it. "Whatever happens with the land office and the lawyer," he said, "what your stepmother is actually afraid of, it's not the water rights agreement. It's not the operational records." He paused. "She's afraid that you're not going to disappear again. That this time, there's no kitchen to lock you in." She looked at him across the room. "She's right to be afraid of that," she said. "Because I'm not." He nodded. She walked out. She rode back to the ranch in the mid-morning sun and found the house quiet. Thomas in his office. Rosalie somewhere, upstairs the kitchen, empty and clean. She went to her room and put her documents away and sat on the edge of her bed for exactly 10 minutes, doing nothing, which was an extraordinary luxury in her daily life, and which she permitted herself, because the last 16 hours had required a significant expenditure of something she was usually careful to conserve. Then she got up. She went to find Thomas. He was at his desk with the ranch's official ledger open in front of him, and an expression that told her he had been reading it with new eyes, the eyes of a man who is re-examining something familiar and finding things in it he had not previously seen. She said, "I need to tell you about the letters," she told him. All of it. The barn, the ledger pages pressed flat. Rosalie at the kitchen table, the envelopes, what was in them. She told him about the Helena lawyer and the land office complaint and the wire Alexander had already sent. Thomas listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "She threatened to have you accused of stealing from the household accounts." 2 years ago, yes. She made a ledger to support it. That's what she told me. Thomas stood up from his desk. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to Evelyn, and she watched his shoulders and waited, and did not try to predict what was coming, because she had learned that Thomas Harper surprised her more than she expected when he was confronted with something he could not rationalize away. He said, "I owe you an accounting." "Father." "No." He turned around. His face was the face of a man who has arrived somewhere difficult and has decided he is not going to back away from it. "I brought that woman into this house. I made that choice. I was grieving and I was lonely, and I made a choice that I didn't look at carefully enough afterward, and you paid for it." He stopped. "I knew things weren't right. I knew you weren't. I knew you weren't happy. I told myself it was the grief. Your grief and mine, and the adjustment of a new family. I told myself it would settle." His voice was controlled, but just barely. "It didn't settle. I just stopped looking." Evelyn said nothing. She stood in the middle of her father's office and let him say it. "I'm going to ask Beatrice to leave," he said. "I'm going to ask her and Rosalie to—" "Not Rosalie," Evelyn said. Thomas blinked. "Rosalie is not her mother," she said. "Rosalie is 21 years old, and she brought me those letters last night. She could have mailed them. She chose not to." She looked at her father steadily. "Whatever you decide about Beatrice Rosalie is not part of it." Thomas looked at his daughter. Then he nodded once slowly. "All right," he said. "All right." He found Beatrice an hour later. Evelyn did not listen at the door. She went to the kitchen and made coffee and gave them the privacy of whatever that conversation required, because she did not need to hear it. She had made her accounting, and Thomas had made his, and what happened now between Thomas and Beatrice was a different conversation from the one that had been happening in this house for 12 years. This one had a different shape. She knew the moment it changed because she heard Beatrice's voice rise just once, briefly breaking through the composed surface for the first time since Evelyn had known her, and then go quiet again. 20 minutes later, Thomas came to the kitchen. He sat down at the table. He looked exhausted in the way a man looks when he has done something that needed doing for a long time, and the relief and the grief of it have arrived simultaneously. She denied it, he said. The letters, the ledger, all of it. I know she did. I told her I had seen the letters. He looked at Evelyn. I told her Rosalie had shown them to you. Evelyn was very still. And, she said Rosalie was confused, that she was mistaken about what she'd seen. He paused. And then she said... He stopped. His jaw tightened. She said you had always been a problem, since the beginning. She said you had never accepted her place in this family, and that everything that had happened was a result of your own choices. He looked at his hands. She said the kitchen door bolted itself. The silence in the kitchen was very still. And what did you say? Evelyn asked. Thomas looked up at her. I told her that I had been willing to believe a lot of things about a lot of situations in this house for a long time, he said, because believing them was easier than not believing them. He paused. I told her I was done believing them. Evelyn looked at her father. She's leaving at the end of the week, he said. She's going to her sister's in Billings. The arrangement will be formal. Her portion of the household is... He stopped. That's not important right now. It's important eventually, Evelyn said. Yes, eventually. He looked at her. Right now what's important is the land office, and the lawyer in Helena, and the water rights agreement. He straightened. And the fact that I am going to write a letter today to the county land office, establishing your operational role in this ranch, formally and legally, with my signature and the Harper Ranch seal. He paused. And I am going to ask Alexander Whitlock, when the agreement is formalized, to acknowledge you as co-manager of record on the document. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. He already proposed that, she said, at the Thursday meeting. Thomas looked at her. I know, he said. I should have agreed immediately. I hesitated. He looked at his hands again. I want to undo that. All right, she said. They were quiet together in the kitchen for a moment. Not the uncomfortable quiet of things unsaid, but something closer to the quiet of two people who have said what needed saying and are now sitting in the aftermath of it, feeling the shape of what's left. Thomas said, the feed supplier, I spoke with him yesterday. What did he say? He denied it at first. Thomas looked up, and there was something in his expression that was the closest thing to hard anger she had ever seen on her father's face. Not hot but cold, the specific anger of a man who has been cheated by someone he trusted. Then I showed him your records, the 30 months of documented discrepancies. He paused. He wrote a check for the full amount, $1,940. Evelyn blinked. You recovered it all? Everything I could prove, he said. Your records were precise enough to prove all of it. He looked at her. He also agreed to terminate the contract. I've already written to 2 alternative suppliers in the county. She thought about 3 years of waking early to weigh feed shipments. 3 years of writing numbers in a notebook she'd bought with her own money because Thomas didn't know she needed it. 3 years of documenting something no one had asked her to document, with no certainty that anyone would ever use it. $1,940, in her notebook, recovered. She said, good. Thomas almost smiled. It was a tired smile, a complicated one, but it was real. You know, Gus told me last spring that the West Pasture irrigation needed addressing. He told me twice. I know, she said. He told me he'd told you. I told him to focus on his own work. I know that too, Thomas nodded. He stood. He straightened his coat with the gesture that she now understood was him reassembling himself not for pretense, but for purpose. I'm going to start the irrigation rerouting next week. I'll need your notes on the drainage pattern. "I'll have them on your desk by morning," she said. He walked to the kitchen door. He stopped. Without turning, he said, "Evelyn, your mother would have—" He stopped. He tried again. "Clara would have been very proud of you. She always said you saw things that other people walked past." He paused. She was right about that. She was right about most things. Evelyn looked at her father's back. She thought about a 7-year-old girl in a too small dress and a grave in the Red Willow churchyard, and a woman she still heard sometimes in the quiet early mornings, in the particular quality of light, before the sun was fully up, when the ranch was still, and she was the only one awake in it. "I know," she said. "She told me too." Thomas walked out. Evelyn sat in the kitchen alone and let the morning settle around her, the sound of the ranch beginning its day outside, the distant voice of Gus, directing the hands in the east pasture, the smell of coffee and wood smoke, and the particular alive smell of a working ranch in summer. She was still sitting there when the sound of a horse came up the road. Not Alexander, she knew his horse now had learned the gait in 3 visits. This was a different horse moving faster with the urgency of something being delivered. She went to the front of the house. A young man from town was at the gate, the hotel clerk's boy, who ran messages between the hotel and the outlying properties. He handed her a folded note. She opened it. Alexander's handwriting. 3 lines. "My lawyer in Helena received word this morning. There is a 3rd letter not from your stepmother, from the feed supplier. He has made a preemptive complaint to the land office claiming the Harper Ranch attempted to coerce a financial settlement using falsified records. He says the records were fabricated by an unauthorized party." She read the 3rd line twice. "They planned this together, the supplier and Beatrice. This has been in motion longer than either of us knew." She stood at the front gate with the note in her hand, and the morning sun fully up now, and the ranch moving around her in its ordinary rhythms, and she felt the specific quality of this new information settling into place, the way a puzzle piece settles when you find the right location, and everything that was slightly off-angle suddenly resolves into clarity. Beatrice and the feed supplier. Together. The false records complaint and the land office letter timed to arrive simultaneously. The parallel documentation pressed flat in the barn meant not just to undermine Evelyn, but to construct a counter-narrative that 2 separate sources would be willing to support. This was not a desperate response to Thursday's meeting. This was something that had been building for longer than Thursday. Maybe longer than the gathering. Maybe much longer. She folded the note. She put it in her pocket. She walked back inside the house with the measured, unhurried steps of a woman who has just understood the full size of what she is dealing with, and has decided that the size of it does not change what she is going to do about it. She went to her room. She unlocked the chest at the bottom of the wardrobe. She took out the ledger, all 30 months of feed weight records, every date, every discrepancy, every signature she had added as a witness. She added today's date at the bottom of the last entry. Noted the recovery of the $1,940, noted Thomas's termination of the contract. Then she picked up a fresh piece of paper and began to write down everything she knew about the timeline when the relationship between Beatrice and the supplier had first shown signs she had missed when the feed discrepancies had begun, what the overlap was. She wrote for an hour. At the end of it, she had 3 pages of careful, specific dated notation. She looked at what she had written. She thought about Beatrice packing her things at the end of the week for Billings. She thought about whether Billings was actually where she was going, or whether it was simply where she had said she was going, which were 2 different things when you were talking about Beatrice Caldwell. She thought about Rosalie at the kitchen table with 2 envelopes in her pocket. She thought about Alexander's note. They planned this together. She picked up her pen and added 1 more line at the bottom of the 3 pages. The supplier's complaint to the land office was not spontaneous. It was coordinated. The coordination required advanced communication and a shared understanding of the goal. Beatrice Caldwell and the feed supplier have a relationship that predates the financial discrepancies. She paused. Then she wrote the question that had been forming at the back of her mind since she read the note. How did Beatrice know what the supplier's records looked like closely enough to coordinate a counterclaim? She sat back in her chair and looked at that question and felt the answer arriving before she had fully finished asking it. Because Beatrice had seen the records. Not Evelyn's records, the supplier's own records. She had seen them because someone had shown her. And the only person who could have shown them to her was someone who had access to both this house and the supplier's operation. She got up from the desk. She went down the hall. She knocked on Rosalie's door. "Come in," Rosalie said in the cautious voice of someone who has been waiting to be found. Evelyn opened the door. She looked at Rosalie sitting on the edge of her bed with her hands folded in her lap and her face arranged into the particular expression of a young woman who has spent her entire life trying to read what the powerful people around her wanted and produce it, and who has in the last 24 hours stopped being sure what that is. "Rosalie," Evelyn said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." Rosalie looked at her. "All right." "The feed supplier," Evelyn said. "Mr. Carver, has your mother ever met with him, not here at the ranch during deliveries, privately, in town or somewhere else?" Rosalie was very still. Her hands tightened in her lap. "I'm not asking to get you in trouble," Evelyn said. "I'm asking because I need to understand the full picture, and I think you know something about it." Rosalie looked at her for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "She met him twice in town, last spring. She said it was about the household accounts. I didn't ask what that meant." She paused. "I should have asked." "Yes," Evelyn said gently. "But you know now, and that matters." Rosalie looked up. Her eyes were bright and not quite steady. "What's going to happen?" Evelyn looked at her half-sister, 21 years old, shaped by 12 years, in Beatrice Caldwell's household, sitting on the edge of a bed in a house that was about to change completely, trying to figure out whether she was going to be buried in the wreckage or whether there was another option. "I don't know yet," Evelyn said honestly. "But I know that whatever happens, you told the truth when you didn't have to. That is not a small thing." She paused. "Come to supper tonight. Sit at the table." Rosalie blinked. "She won't." "She's not making the seating arrangements anymore," Evelyn said. "Come to supper." She went back to her room and picked up her 3 pages and the ledger and her coat. She had a horse to saddle and a ride to make, and she had a great deal more to tell Alexander Whitlock than she had known this morning when she rode into town. The ground was shifting under all of them. She could feel it moving. But she had learned in the last 4 days something she should have understood years ago. Shifting ground only terrified the people who had been standing still. Evelyn Harper had never been still a day in her life. She rode into town at a pace that was not quite urgent, but was not comfortable either. The pace of a woman who has information that cannot wait, and has decided that the fastest way to deliver it is to deliver it herself. Alexander was not at the hotel. The clerk said he had gone to the county land office an hour ago. Evelyn turned her horse and rode 3 streets over, and found his horse tied at the post outside the low wooden building that served as Red Willow's official records office, and she went in without pausing at the door. Howe was at the counter with a man she recognized, Deputy Recorder Haynes, who had held the position for 20 years, and who had the specific manner of a man who processed everything that came across his desk with equal slowness, regardless of how urgent it was. Alexander was presenting documents. Haynes was examining them with the methodical attention of a man who was in no hurry and knew it. Alexander looked up when she came in. He read her face in the space of a second. "Haynes," he said, "give us a moment." Haynes gave them more than a moment. He retreated to the back room with the unhurried dignity of a man who had learned not to be curious about other people's business. Alexander crossed to where Evelyn was standing, and she handed him the 3 pages she had written without preamble. He read them. He did not rush through it. When he reached the last line, how did Beatrice know what the supplier's records looked like closely enough to coordinate a counterclaim? He looked up. "You found the answer," he said. It wasn't a question. "Rosalie," she said. 2 meetings, last spring. Beatrice met with Carver in town privately and told Rosalie it was about household accounts. Spring, he said. He was doing the arithmetic. The gathering was planned in June. If she met with Carver in spring, she was preparing before your father announced the celebration. Which means she wasn't responding to the water rights discussion, Evelyn said. She was already building this before she knew about Alexander Whitlock and the water rights. She was building it because she knew eventually someone was going to look at this ranch closely enough to see what my records showed. Alexander was very still. She was afraid of the records long before I arrived. She was afraid of me long before you arrived, Evelyn said. The records were the evidence. I was the threat. He looked at her for a moment. Then he turned back to the counter and called for Haynes. Haynes reappeared. Alexander said, I need to amend the documentation I submitted. I have additional information that's relevant to the complaint filed against the Harper Ranch. He looked at Evelyn. Miss Harper, will you present your records? She put her ledger on the counter. She put the 3 pages of timeline documentation beside it. She stood at that counter for 40 minutes and walked Haynes through 30 months of feed weight records. The 2 meetings between Beatrice and Carver that Rosalie had witnessed the timeline of the letters and who had received them and when, and the specific inconsistency between Carver's complaint that the records were fabricated by an unauthorized party and Thomas Harper's signed statement from that morning, which Alexander produced from his coat pocket, confirming that Evelyn had been operating as the ranch's de facto manager for years with his full knowledge. Thomas had signed it before Evelyn left the house. She had not asked him to. He had written it himself, folded it, and put it in her saddlebag without comment. Haynes looked at Thomas's statement. He looked at the ledger. He looked at Carver's complaint, which he pulled from his files with the slow efficiency of a man who had a system and was going to use it regardless of how long it took. He compared the dates. The complaint from the supplier was filed yesterday morning, Haynes said. Before Thomas Harper filed the formal termination of contract, Alexander said, and before he recovered the $1,900. The supplier filed a complaint claiming falsified records, Haynes said slowly. The same morning he wrote a check acknowledging the discrepancy was real. Yes, Evelyn said. He did. Haynes looked at the 2 documents side by side for a long moment. Something in his expression shifted the specific shift of a man whose methodical processing has arrived at a conclusion that even his slowness cannot delay. That's a problem for Mr. Carver, he said. It is, Alexander said. And I'd like it noted formally in the record that the complaint against the Harper Ranch operational documentation was filed in coordination with a financial counterclaim that was refuted the same day by the complainant's own financial settlement. Haynes wrote something in his ledger. He wrote for a long time. Neither of them rushed him. When he was finished, he looked up. The complaint is noted as contested, he said. I'll need the full documentation submitted formally before I can close it. But he looked at Carver's complaint again. I don't see this going anywhere given the circumstances. They walked out of the land office into the mid-morning street, and Evelyn stood for a moment in the open air and let the last hour settle through her, the specific relief of having done something correctly, precisely without missing a step, arriving at exactly the outcome she had aimed for. Your father's statement was decisive, Alexander said. I didn't ask him for it, she said. I know. He looked at her. He wrote it because he wanted to. She said nothing. She thought about Thomas at his desk that morning with the ranch ledger open and his face doing its slow, painful arithmetic. She thought about, I owe you an accounting said to the kitchen floor. The Helena lawyer, she said. Beatrice's letter. My lawyer is already handling it, Alexander said. It will be resolved by the end of the week. The letter makes claims that Beatrice cannot substantiate, not with Carver's complaint discredited and your father's formal statement on record. He paused. But there's something else. She looked at him. My lawyer found something when he started pulling the Helena records, Alexander said. He was watching her face carefully. Something that wasn't in any of the letters or the land office complaint. He paused. Evelyn. Carver's operation, the feed supplier, has been under review by the Territorial Trade Office since March. Not for the weight discrepancies here. For a pattern of the same practice across 7 other ranches in 2 counties. She stood very still. 7 other ranches. The same method. Short weight deliveries, consistent 4 to 6% variance documentation designed to be difficult to prove without the kind of records you kept. He looked at her. Your records, the 30 months of documented discrepancies, are the most complete evidence the trade office has seen. Every other rancher either didn't notice or didn't document it systematically enough to use. She absorbed this. They're going to use my records. They already asked, he said. My lawyer forwarded them this morning with your father's permission. Thomas agreed immediately. He paused. Evelyn, you didn't just recover $1,900 for the Harper Ranch. You handed the Territorial Trade Office the case they've been trying to build for 6 months. The street was quiet around them. A wagon went by. Someone called a greeting from across the way. The ordinary morning of Red Willow, Montana, proceeding in its ordinary fashion, while something that was not ordinary at all was being said on the sidewalk outside the records office. She said, Carver was doing this across 7 ranches. At minimum. With Beatrice's help, or at least with her knowledge, Alexander was very still. We don't know yet how deep that runs, whether she was complicit in the broader scheme, or whether she was simply using an existing arrangement for her own purposes. He paused. My lawyer is looking into it. But Evelyn, if Beatrice had prior knowledge of a coordinated fraud scheme across multiple ranches, the conversation with your father about her leaving is going to become something more complicated. She thought about Beatrice packing for Billings. She thought about how certain she had been this morning that she knew the shape of what she was dealing with. She thought about how confident and focused Beatrice had been, even after the gathering, even after Thomas's confrontation, the composure of a woman who knew she had reserves she hadn't deployed yet. Maybe the reserves were not personal. Maybe the reserves were legal. We need to tell Thomas, she said. I'll ride back with you, Alexander said. They rode together, and the ride that had taken her 30 minutes this morning took 20 on the return, because neither of them was dawdling, and for most of it, they were quiet. Not the uncertain quiet of two people who don't know what to say to each other, but the working quiet of two people thinking through the same problem from different angles. Halfway back, Alexander said, when this is over, she said before he could finish, there will be something else. There's always something else on a working ranch. The irrigation rerouting, the East herd breeding cycle, the formal water rights agreement that still needs to be finalized. She looked at him sideways. I'm not waiting for some clear horizon that doesn't exist. He looked at her. That's not what I was going to say. She looked back at him. I was going to say, he said, that when this particular crisis is over, I'd like to take you to supper, in town, at the hotel dining room, not a business meeting, not a records discussion. He paused. Supper. She was quiet for a moment. She watched the road ahead of them. She thought about a man who had come early to meetings so nobody could arrange what he'd see before he arrived, who had sent a wire to Helena before the letters arrived, who had stood at the land office counter and presented her records alongside his own name, as though the combination was the most natural thing in the world. All right, she said. Supper. He nodded. They rode. Thomas was in the yard when they arrived, standing with Gus near the south barn, the two of them looking at something on the fence line, the ordinary activity of a ranch morning that had no idea what was about to interrupt it. He looked up when they rode in together and took in their expressions and said immediately, what happened? They told him in the kitchen. Alexander laid it out clearly, the Territorial Trade Office, the 7 ranches, the pattern, the question of Beatrice's involvement. Thomas listened the way he had learned to listen over the past week, not with the half-attention of a man waiting to redirect the conversation, but with the full, uncomfortable attention of someone who has decided they are going to face what is in front of them. When Alexander finished, Thomas sat at the kitchen table and was quiet for a long time. Then he said, she knew about Carver's operation. Evelyn looked at him. We don't know that for certain yet. I know it, Thomas said. His voice was flat. Not because I can prove it, because of something she said 3 years ago when I mentioned the feed discrepancy issue to her. I'd noticed the numbers were off once, just once, and I dismissed it. And she said... He stopped. He pressed his hands flat on the table. She said it was probably just measurement variance, that feed suppliers all did it, and it was industry standard, and I'd be wasting time chasing it. He looked at Evelyn. Industry standard, that's what she called it. Evelyn looked at her father. She thought about the one time she had brought him the feed weight discrepancy and been told to let Gus handle it. She thought about whether Beatrice had been in the room that day or nearby, and she was almost certain she had been. She redirected you, Evelyn said. She knew what you were finding, Thomas said. That's why she wanted you away from the supply questions. He looked at his hands. She was protecting Carver's operation because she had something in it. We need to know what, Alexander said, before she leaves for Billings. They looked at each other. Thomas, Evelyn, Alexander, and the understanding moved between them without needing to be stated aloud. Beatrice was leaving at the end of the week. Whatever she carried with her out of this house, she would not be bringing back. I'll talk to her, Thomas said. I want to be there, Evelyn said. Thomas looked at her. Evelyn, I want to be there, she said again, and her voice was not loud, but it had the quality of a door being held open that was not going to be closed again. Whatever she says, I want to hear it directly. I'm done receiving information about my own life secondhand. Thomas held her gaze. Then he nodded. They found Beatrice in her room. She was not packing, which told Evelyn something a woman who was planning to leave for Billings at the end of the week would have begun packing by now. She was sitting at her writing desk, with nothing in front of her, which told Evelyn something else. She had been expecting this conversation. Thomas said, "We need to talk about Carver." Beatrice looked up. Her face was composed. It was always composed. But Evelyn, who had been reading that face for 12 years, saw something underneath the composition that she had not seen there before. Not fear exactly, but its well-dressed cousin. The specific tension of a person who has been running a calculation and has arrived at a number they don't like. I don't know what you mean, Beatrice said. Yes, you do, Thomas said. The trade office in Helena, the 7 ranches, the weight scheme that's been running for 3 years. He paused. Carver told the land office the Harper records were falsified. He filed that complaint the morning he paid back $1,900. A man doesn't do that unless someone told him to. And the only person in this house who knew what was in Evelyn's records was you. Beatrice looked at Thomas. Then she looked at Evelyn. Her eyes moved across Evelyn's face with the particular attention of someone looking for a handhold. Something she could use, some angle of approach, some version of events that could still be shaped into something manageable. She found nothing. Evelyn's face gave her nothing to work with. I introduced Carver to a business arrangement, Beatrice said finally. Not an admission, not quite. The careful language of a woman who was still deciding how much of the structure she was going to let fall. An arrangement that existed before I came to this house. I didn't create it. I simply knew about it. You knew he was shorting the weights, Thomas said. I knew how he operated, Beatrice said. That's not the same thing. You told me it was industry standard, Thomas said. When I noticed the discrepancy 3 years ago, you told me every supplier did it. Beatrice was quiet. You redirected me, Thomas said, deliberately, because if I looked closely at the feed weights I'd find what Evelyn had already found, and Carver's operation would come apart. His voice was not raised. It was very level, the levelness of a man who has moved past anger into something colder and more deliberate. What did you get out of it, Beatrice? What was he paying you? The silence in the room was absolute. Beatrice looked at her hands. For the first time in 12 years, Evelyn watched her stepmother's composure develop a crack, not a collapse, not a fracture, but a visible line in the surface, the place where the structure beneath was beginning to show through. A commission, Beatrice said, very quietly. For the introduction. For keeping the arrangement protected. She paused. 5% of the monthly variance. Thomas did the arithmetic faster than Evelyn expected. 5% of the variance across 7 ranches over 3 years, he said. Beatrice, that's... It was my security, Beatrice said. Her voice was still quiet, but something had changed in it. The careful performance of reasonableness was gone, and what was underneath it was not the cold calculation Evelyn had expected, but something rawer, something that was almost if not quite a woman explaining herself. I came into this house with nothing but Rosalie and a reputation, Thomas. You were never going to leave me destitute, I know that. But I had no guarantee, no formal arrangement. If something happened to you, if you decided... She stopped. I needed security that was mine, that no one could take. Thomas looked at his wife. His face was doing something complicated and slow. So you stole it, he said, from ranching families who were already working hard enough. I introduced a connection, Beatrice said. I didn't operate the scheme. You protected it, Evelyn said. It was the first thing she had said since entering the room, and both Thomas and Beatrice looked at her. Thomas with the attention of a man who wants to hear what comes next. Beatrice with the attention of a woman bracing for a blow. For 3 years you protected it. You redirected my father when he noticed the discrepancy. You tried to discredit my records. You filed letters with the land office and a lawyer in Helena to create confusion before anyone could look too closely. She paused. You didn't just take a commission, Beatrice. You actively worked to prevent the truth from coming out. That's not introducing a connection. That's participating in a fraud. Beatrice looked at her. She looked at her for a long time, and Evelyn held her gaze and did not look away, because she was done being the one who looked away. You always saw too much, Beatrice said finally. Not with anger, with something that was strangely almost like respect, the bitter kind, the kind that acknowledges a threat without wanting to. Even when you were 11 years old, you looked at things too carefully. She paused. That's why. I know, Evelyn said. That's why the kitchen. That's why the dress. That's why 12 years of being kept out of every room where things were being decided. She looked at her stepmother steadily. You weren't protecting Rosalie from competition. You were protecting a scheme from someone who would eventually figure it out. Beatrice did not deny it. She looked at her hands again. Thomas stood up. He said, I'm going to need you to write down everything. Every payment, every meeting with Carver, every communication. The trade office in Helena is going to want a full accounting, and it's better for you to provide it voluntarily than to have them come looking for it. He paused. My lawyer will be here Monday. You'll speak with him. Beatrice looked up at Thomas. Something moved across her face that might in different circumstances have been called grief. And then, Thomas said, whatever the trade office and the law decide. That's not my choice anymore. He walked to the door. He stopped. He said without turning, I'm sorry, Beatrice. Not for this conversation. For the fact that you felt like you needed to do this in the first place. I should have given you formal security from the beginning. I should have made the arrangement clear and legal and permanent so you didn't feel like you had to build your own. He paused. That's on me. The choices you made because of it are on you. He walked out. Evelyn stood alone with Beatrice for a moment. The room was very quiet. Outside the ranch was making its ordinary morning sounds. Horses, cattle, the distant voice of a ranch hand calling to another. The sounds of a world that had kept moving through everything. Beatrice said without looking up. Rosalie told you. Rosalie made a choice, Evelyn said. The right one. Beatrice nodded, very slowly. I know. She paused. She's more like you than I wanted her to be. Evelyn looked at her stepmother, this woman who had arranged 12 years of erasure with such precision that Thomas hadn't seen it, who had run a financial scheme across 7 ranches for 3 years with such care that no one had been able to prove it until a girl in a kitchen with a notebook and a scale had simply refused to stop writing things down. She looked at this woman who had been afraid in her own way and had chosen the wrong response to that fear and had built something that was now coming apart in a room that smelled like cedar and old paper. She did not feel triumph. She had expected to feel triumph, had thought that the moment of Beatrice's exposure would carry the particular satisfaction of a long wrong finally being righted. Instead, what she felt was tired. And underneath the tiredness, something quieter. The specific relief of a person who has been carrying a weight for so long, they have forgotten what it feels like to set it down, and is only now in this moment beginning to feel the difference in their shoulders. Take care of Rosalie, Evelyn said. Whatever happens with the trade office and the legal arrangements, she's your daughter. Take care of her. Beatrice looked up. For one moment, just one, the composition was entirely gone, and what was on her face was simply a woman who had made too many wrong choices for too many complicated reasons, and was now sitting in the wreckage of them. I always tried to, she said. I know, Evelyn said. Try better. She walked out. Alexander was waiting at the bottom of the stairs. He had heard enough to understand the shape of it without needing the details. He looked at her face and said nothing, which was exactly right. They went to the kitchen. Evelyn put the kettle on. She made 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of Alexander and sat across from him at the kitchen table where she had eaten 10,000 breakfasts alone and sat with her records at midnight and heard Beatrice's footsteps in the hallway and planned the next day's work in the 4 o'clock dark. She said, "The trade office will want to interview Carver. If Beatrice cooperates, they may offer her some consideration." "My lawyer thinks so," Alexander said. "The commission payments are documented. She won't be able to pretend they don't exist. But active cooperation against Carver changes the picture significantly. Thomas's lawyer will advise her to cooperate." "Probably." He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. "It doesn't undo it. The other 7 ranches, those families lost money the same way your father did." "I know," Evelyn said. She thought about those 7 families. 7 sets of feed weights, slightly off every month, not enough to make you certain, but enough to add up. 7 families who had trusted a supplier and been quietly stolen from. "Are their records recoverable?" "Some of them. My lawyer is reaching out." He looked at her. "The trade office wants to use your documentation as the template for what they're asking the other ranchers to reconstruct from memory. Your records are the baseline." She thought about 3 years of early mornings, and a scale she had bought herself, and a notebook that no one asked for. She thought about Gus saying that Whitlock knew what questions to ask, and herself thinking that Alexander had come prepared to look. She thought about the specific way things accumulate weight by weight, page by page, morning by morning, until they become something that cannot be dismissed or redirected or locked in a kitchen. "Good," she said. They sat in the quiet for a moment, and it was the particular quiet of 2 people who have been through something together that required both of them, and who are now on the other side of it and are beginning to understand what the other side feels like. Thomas came to the kitchen doorway. He looked at Alexander. He looked at Evelyn. He said, "I've sent for my lawyer. He'll be here Monday." He paused. "The water rights agreement. We'll wait until this is resolved," Alexander said. "There's no urgency that overrides doing this correctly." Thomas nodded. He looked at his daughter. "Rosalie's downstairs," he said. "She asked if she could eat supper with us." "She doesn't need to ask," Evelyn said. "I told her that this morning." Thomas looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said. "You did." He went back to his office, and his footsteps down the hall were different from the footsteps he had made in this house for 12 years. Slower, more deliberate, the footsteps of a man who was walking carefully, because he had realized the ground under him was not what he had thought it was, and he was choosing consciously where to put his weight. Rosalie appeared in the kitchen door 20 minutes later. She stood there with her hands at her sides and her face uncertain, looking at Evelyn and then at Alexander, and then at the kitchen table, where there was coffee and afternoon light and the ordinary arrangement of a room where people sat and talked. "Come in," Evelyn said. Rosalie came in. She sat at the table. She looked at her hands. Then she said to Evelyn quietly, "Is she going to be all right?" Evelyn thought about the honest answer and the kind answer and whether they were the same thing. "I don't know yet," she said. "But she's going to get the chance to make better choices. That's more than some people get." Rosalie nodded. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've been thinking about what you said, about looking at things too carefully." She looked up. "She used to say that about you, that you looked at things too much, that you made everything complicated." She paused. "I always thought she meant it as a criticism." "She did," Evelyn said. "I think she meant it as a warning," Rosalie said, "to herself. She said it carefully, the way someone says something they have been working out for a while and are not quite sure of yet. She was always afraid of what you were going to see." Evelyn looked at her half-sister. She thought about 21 years old and the wrong lessons learned from the wrong teacher and the particular courage it required to start unlearning them. "You saw it too," Evelyn said. "Last night. You saw the envelopes and you made the right choice." "I was scared," Rosalie said. "Most right choices are," Evelyn said. Alexander, who had been quiet through this, with the particular courtesy of a man who understands when a conversation belongs to other people, stood and picked up his hat. He said to Evelyn, I'll be at the hotel through Monday. Send word if anything changes before then." She walked him to the door. Outside, his horse was where he'd tied it, patient, and still the way good horses are. He untied the reins. He was about to mount, and then he paused, and he turned, and he looked at her with the directness she had come to expect from him. The quality of a man who said the thing he meant to say, rather than the thing that was easier. "You know what you did," he said. "With those records. You spent 3 years documenting something with no guarantee anyone was ever going to see it. No guarantee it would ever matter. You just kept going. Because it was accurate, and it was right, and those were sufficient reasons." She looked at him. "7 families," he said. "That's who got their money back because you kept going when there was no reason to think it would matter." She did not know what to say to that. She was not accustomed to being told the full weight of what she had done, not by anyone, not in terms she could not deflect or minimize. She was accustomed to working and moving on to the next thing, because the next thing was always there. She said, "I kept the records because I couldn't stand not knowing the truth." "I know," he said. "That's what I mean." He mounted. He looked down at her from the horse with the evening light behind him and the full size of the Montana summer sky above all of it. "Thursday supper," he said. "I'll make the reservation." "I'll be there," she said. He rode. She watched him go until he reached the road and turned north toward town, and then she stood in the yard for a moment in the cooling air and thought about nothing in particular, which was unusual for her, and felt in its rarity almost like a gift. The following days moved quickly and not quietly. Thomas's lawyer arrived Monday and spent 3 hours with Beatrice. She cooperated completely with the specific efficiency of a woman who had calculated that cooperation was her best remaining option and had decided to be excellent at it. By Tuesday evening, the trade office in Helena had a full account of the commission payments, the meetings with Carver, and the timeline of communication. By Wednesday, Carver himself was in conversation with the trade office's investigator, and the numbers being discussed covered 3 years and 7 ranches, and an amount that made the Harper Ranch's $1,900 look like a footnote. Evelyn was present for none of those conversations, which was correct. She was not a lawyer and not a trade official, and her role in the legal proceedings was already established through her documentation. She spent those days doing what she always did, ranch work. The South Boundary Survey notes had gone to Alexander's lawyer. The irrigation rerouting had been contracted with a crew that would start Monday. The East herd bulls had been flagged for the fall sale. The feed supplier's replacement had been sourced, and the new contract was on Thomas's desk for signature. The ranch did not pause. She did not pause. But the work felt different now, not lighter, not easier, but different in the particular way that things feel different when you are doing them, without the weight of invisibility pressing on your shoulders. When Gus came to her with a question, she answered it with the same knowledge she had always had, but now she answered it at the kitchen table rather than in the barn doorway. And Thomas sometimes heard the answer, and sometimes asked a follow-up question, and the information moved through the house, the way it was supposed to move through a working operation, directly, clearly to the people who needed it. It was, she thought, simply what functional looked like. She had known what functional looked like for years. She had been building it in secret for years. Now it was just there, in the open, doing what it had always been capable of doing. Thursday came. She put on the best dress she owned, which was the gray cotton dress with the white cuffs that Beatrice had taken from her room the night of the gathering, and that Thomas had returned to her without comment the morning after Beatrice moved into the guest room. She had mended the sleeve seam again and pressed it, and it was clean and neat, and it was hers, and that was enough. Alexander was waiting at the hotel dining room when she arrived. He stood when she came in, not the performed gallantry of a man who has been told to stand, but the natural response of someone who sees a person they are glad to see. He pulled out her chair. He sat across from her. The dining room was half full. Several people recognized her. Red Willow was a small enough town that most people recognized, most other people, and she saw the looks, the assessments, the quick social calculations of people who were updating their picture of Evelyn Harper against the new information that she was having supper at the hotel dining room with Alexander Whitlock. She did not manage those looks. She did not arrange her expression for their benefit. She looked at Alexander across the table and said, "How did the Helena situation resolve?" He told her. Carver was facing formal charges. The trade office had recovered documentation sufficient to pursue restitution for 5 of the 7 affected ranches. The other 2 were still being assessed. Beatrice's cooperation had been noted and would be considered, though what it was being considered toward was still a legal question. The land office complaint had been formally withdrawn and the record had been corrected. "And the water rights agreement," she said. "Ready to formalize," he said. "I'd like to do it next week, with your signature on the document." "Thomas's lawyer has the draft," she said. "I reviewed it yesterday. There are 2 clauses I want to revise." "Tell me," he said. She told him. He listened. He agreed with 1 revision and pushed back on the second, and she defended her position, and he considered it and revised his own position, and by the time their food arrived, they had worked through both clauses and arrived at language that was better than what either of them had started with. They ate. They talked not only business, but not business either, because neither of them was the kind of person who drew a clean line between the two. They talked about the Whitlock Ranch's northern operations, about the changes Alexander had made since taking over from his father. They talked about what the territorial water rights framework was likely to look like in 10 years if the northern rail extension came through as projected. They talked about cattle breeding philosophy in ways that would have seemed impossibly dry to most people at a supper table and felt to both of them like the most natural possible conversation to be having. At some point, Evelyn became aware that the dining room had emptied around them. The half-full room had filled and then emptied, and they had been sitting here for 2 hours without noticing the time move. Alexander noticed it at the same moment. He looked at the empty tables and looked at her and said, "I've kept you too long." "I didn't notice," she said. It was true. I was quiet for a moment. He set his coffee cup down. He said carefully in the register he used when he was saying something he had been thinking about for a while, "I want to be clear with you about something." She looked at him. "I came to your father's gathering for the water rights," he said. "That part was true, but I stayed the going back the meeting, all of it I stayed because of what I found in that kitchen. Not the records, not the feed weights or the pasture survey or any of the documentation." He paused. "I stayed because of you. Who you are. How you think. The fact that you had spent 3 years documenting something in a notebook with no audience and no acknowledgement, and you just kept going because it was true and accurate, and that was enough." He looked at her directly. "I want you to know that. The business and the rest of it are separate. I know how to keep them separate." Evelyn looked at him across the table. She thought about 11 years old in a too small dress. She thought about gray cotton and kitchen fires, and 30 months of feed weights written in a notebook no one asked for. She thought about a barn door opening and a man who had taken his hat off before he saw who was inside. She said, "I know you do." "Good," he said, "because I intend to keep coming back." She looked at him for a long moment. Outside the hotel windows, Red Willow was quiet in the Thursday evening dark. The kind of dark that comes in late summer when the days are still long, but beginning to shorten, and the air carries the first hint of what's coming, even when it's still warm. "You should know," she said, "that I am not an easy person." "I've noticed," he said. "I have opinions about water rights frameworks and cattle breeding cycles and feed supplier contracts, and I express them." "Yes," he said. "I've experienced this. And I am not going to stop running the Harper Ranch operation because someone thinks I should be doing something more appropriate for Evelyn," he said. She stopped. "I know," he said. "That's why I'm here." She was quiet. Then she said, "All right." And she said it with the particular quality of a woman who is accepting something, not because she has been persuaded into it, but because she has looked at it clearly and decided that it is what she wants. "All right." He walked her to her horse. The street was empty. The stars were extraordinary the way they are in Montana when the air is clear, vast and close, at the same time the kind of sky that makes you feel both very small and very present. He held the reins while she mounted. He looked up at her. "Next Thursday," he said. "I'll be here," she said. She rode home through the dark with the stars overhead, and the horse moving steady under her, and the warm August night around her, and she thought about what Alexander had said. "That's why I'm here." and she thought about the 3 years of notebooks and the kitchen door and the barn and her father's face and Rosalie at the table and Beatrice's composure finally cracking in a bedroom that smelled of cedar. She thought about what it meant to be seen. Not the performance of being seen, not the gathering, not the arm through the barn door, not the moment when everyone in the room looked at her. The real version. The version that happened in a hotel kitchen at 2 o'clock in the morning when someone read 30 months of feed records and asked, "How did you know to check?" and listened to the answer with the full attention it deserved. The real version had been happening for a week. Quietly, consistently, without performance. The same way she had been doing everything for 12 years, except now she was not alone in the room when she did it. She turned onto the Harper Ranch Road. Ahead of her the house was dark, except for one lamp burning in the kitchen window, which was Thomas, she knew, because Thomas had started keeping late hours at the kitchen table, with her records spread around him, reading 12 years of documentation, with the careful, grieved attention of a man learning something he should have known a long time ago. She unsaddled her horse. She put him up for the night. She walked across the yard to the house and she went in through the kitchen door, and Thomas looked up from the table. "Good supper," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a moment. He said, "The irrigation crew is confirmed for Monday. I approved the contract this afternoon." "Good," she said. "And the East herd breeding schedule is on your desk," she said. "I left it this afternoon." He nodded. He looked at the ledger open in front of him. He said, "Evelyn, these records, all of this work, I should have been looking at this years ago." "Yes," she said. "You should have." "I'm looking at it now," he said. She looked at her father at the kitchen table in the lamplight, reading 12 years of her work with the slow, determined attention of a man who was trying to understand what he had missed. And she felt something move through her that was not resentment, and not quite forgiveness, and not quite love, but was something that lived in all three of those territories at once, and was perhaps simply what the truth felt like when you finally put it down in the open where everyone could see it. "I know you are," she said. "That's enough for tonight, Father. Get some sleep." She took her lamp and went to her room. She set it on the desk beside the locked chest. She opened the chest and looked at the ledgers stacked inside it. 30 months of records, the pasture survey, the breeding documentation, the notes on the south boundary water flow. She closed the chest. She did not lock it. There was no reason to lock it anymore. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and listened to the ranch settle into the night around her, the horses in the barn, the cattle in the far pasture, the creek running at the south boundary, the way it had always run, seasonal and variable, and nothing like what the county map said it was. She had mapped it herself. She had walked every inch of it and written down what she found and kept the record in a locked chest because no one had asked for it. And now the record was in a lawyer's office in Helena, and a water rights agreement was being finalized with her name on it, and 7 ranch families were getting money back that had been stolen from them, one shipment at a time. She had not done any of it for recognition. She had done it because it was accurate and it was right, and those were sufficient reasons, and they had always been sufficient reasons. And they would continue to be sufficient reasons long after this particular chapter was finished. But it was different, she thought, when the work did not have to be hidden. When the locked chest could stay unlocked. When the notebook came out in daylight and was read by people who understood what they were reading and acted on what they found. It was different when you were seen. She lay down. She closed her eyes. Outside, the Montana night was enormous and quiet and full of stars, and tomorrow the ranch would wake with her before the sun, the same as always. Because the ranch did not pause, and she did not pause. And the difference between this morning and every morning before it was simply this: she was no longer doing it alone. The letter from the Territorial Trade Office arrived on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after Beatrice left for Billings. Evelyn was at the kitchen table with her morning coffee and the East herd breeding schedule when Thomas brought it in from the post. He set it in front of her without opening it, which told her something about how much had changed 3 months ago. Thomas Harper did not bring letters to Evelyn's place at the table. 3 months ago, Evelyn did not have a place at the table. She opened it. She read it twice. Then she set it down and looked at Thomas. "Carver pled guilty," she said, "to the full scheme. 7 ranches, 3 years documented fraud. The trade office recovered full restitution for 6 of the 7 families. She paused. Beatrice received a reduced finding in exchange for her testimony. She'll pay a civil penalty. No criminal charge. Thomas sat down across from her. He looked at the letter. He did not pick it up. The other families, he said. They're whole. The 6 that had sufficient records, she said. The 7th family, the Brannons up in Chouteau County, their documentation wasn't complete enough to quantify the full loss. They're getting a partial recovery. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Is there anything we can do for the Brannons? She looked at her father. This was new too, not the impulse to help, because Thomas had always had that impulse in the abstract, but the specific directness of it, the immediate instinct to ask what could be done rather than what the situation required. I can reach out to their foreman, she said. If they're willing to reconstruct their delivery records from memory and match them against Carver's invoices, my methodology is documented clearly enough to support a supplemental claim. It would take time, but it's possible. Do it, Thomas said. She wrote the letter to the Brannons' foreman that afternoon. She also wrote a letter she had not been planning to write, had not known she was going to write, until she sat down at the desk and found herself reaching for a fresh piece of paper with a clarity of purpose that felt less like a decision and more like an inevitability. She wrote to the Territorial Trade Office directly, not about the Brannon situation, but with a proposal, a standardized documentation protocol for feed and supply deliveries across Montana ranches, based on the methodology she had developed over 3 years in the Harper Ranch barn. Clear, simple, replicable. The kind of system that any ranch hand with basic literacy and a scale could maintain. She described the system in 4 pages. She attached a sample template. She sent it with the Morning Post before she could talk herself out of it. She did not tell anyone she had sent it. She went back to the irrigation rerouting, which was halfway done, and the east herd preparation and the south boundary water rights finalization, which was scheduled for signing on Friday. Friday came. Alexander arrived at the Harper Ranch at 10 o'clock with his lawyer and 2 copies of the water rights agreement, and Thomas's lawyer was already in the sitting room with coffee, and the 4 of them spent an hour going through the final document clause by clause. When they reached the signature page, Alexander's lawyer set the document flat on the desk and said, "Both parties' operational representatives need to sign." Thomas signed first. Then he looked at Evelyn and pushed the document toward her. She picked up the pen. She looked at the signature line, Evelyn Grace Harper, Operational Co-Manager, Harper Ranch, and she signed her name in the same careful, steady handwriting she had used to fill 30 months of feed weight records in a notebook she had bought herself. She set the pen down. Alexander's lawyer witnessed both signatures. Alexander's lawyer said something to Thomas about the filing timeline. Evelyn did not hear most of it because she was looking at her name on the document and thinking about all the mornings she had done the work that justified that name being there, and about the fact that the work had always been there. The name was just the work finally becoming visible. Alexander walked her to the barn afterward, the way they did now, not deliberately, not with the self-consciousness of people who are being watched, but with the natural ease of 2 people who have discovered that they think well in each other's company and have stopped apologizing for seeking it. "The trade office letter," he said. "I heard this morning." "The Brannons," she said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "What are you going to do about it?" "I'm already doing it," she said. She told him about the letter to the Brannons' foreman. He listened. He asked one question about the supplemental claim process, and she answered it, and he nodded and did not suggest anything. She hadn't already thought of, which she had come to understand, was one of the things she valued most about him. The specific quality of a man who could tell the difference between a problem that needed his input and a problem that was already being handled. "I also sent something to the trade office," she said. She told him about the documentation protocol proposal. He stopped walking. He looked at her. "You sent a methodology proposal to the Territorial Trade Office." "Someone should," she said. "The Brannon situation wouldn't exist if ranches had a standard system. What I built wasn't complicated, it was just consistent. That's replicable." He looked at her for a long moment, with the expression she had learned to read over the past weeks. The one that was not quite surprise, and not quite something else, but was somewhere in the territory where a person processes discovering again that the person they are looking at is larger than the frame they have been putting around them. "All right," he said. "You're not going to tell me it's overreaching." "No," he said. "I was going to say that my operation runs 63 supply contracts a year, and I'd like to implement your protocol across all of them if you're willing to consult on the adaptation." He paused. "I'll pay you for the consultation. That's not charity, it's what the work is worth." She looked at him. "I haven't heard back from the trade office yet." "You will," he said. And the certainty in it was not the hollow certainty of flattery, but the specific certainty of a man who had read her 4-page proposal and knew what it was. "You will." She was right that she would. The response came 2 weeks later, a formal letter from the trade office's chief inspector, thanking her for the methodology submission and requesting a meeting to discuss potential territory-wide implementation. It also noted in the last paragraph that her documentation of the Carver scheme had been cited in the formal complaint filed with the territorial legislature calling for new regulations on supply contracts in the ranching industry. Her records in a notebook she had bought herself documented in the dark because no one had asked her to do it, and she couldn't stand not knowing the truth were being cited in the territorial legislature. She read the letter at the kitchen table on a Wednesday morning with her coffee and the East Herd schedule the same as she always did, and she set it down and looked at the window for a long moment, and then she got up and went to find Thomas. How was in his office? She put the letter on his desk. He read it. His face went through several things quickly, and then it settled into the expression she had been seeing on him more frequently in the past months. Not quite pride, because pride had connotations of ownership that didn't fit, but something adjacent, something that was specifically about her and what she had done and was doing, something that belonged entirely to a father, looking at a daughter and understanding late and fully what he had been given. "Evelyn," he said. "It's good news," she said. "I'm going to the meeting." "I know you are," he said. He stopped. He picked up the letter again, looked at it. "I want to say something, and I want to say it correctly." She waited. "You built all of this," he said. "The records, the protocol, all of it. You built it inside a house that was trying to make you invisible, and you built it anyway, and you built it so well that now the territory is going to use it." He looked up at her. "That's not because of me. That's not because of Alexander, or the water rights, or any of the things that happened this summer. That's because of you, who you are." He paused. "I want to make sure you know I know that." Evelyn looked at her father. She thought about 7 years old, and Clara's eyes, and a man who had buried his grief in ledger books, and had not looked up from them for long enough to see what his daughter was building at the kitchen table while he worked. She thought about 12 years. She thought about the locked chest, now unlocked. She thought about what her mother had said. You see things that other people walk past, and about the fact that seeing things was not in the end a burden. It was simply who she was. It had always been who she was, and it had led her through everything to exactly here. "I know you know it," she said. "That matters, Father, more than you probably think it does." He nodded. He was quiet. Then, "Will you be home for supper?" "Yes," she said. "Rosalie is making the pie." Something in his expression lightened. "She's getting better at it." "She is," Evelyn said. She just needed someone to show her the right amount of butter. She walked back to the kitchen where Rosalie was at the table with a bowl of apples and a paring knife, and the specific focused expression of someone learning to be competent at something and finding the process more satisfying than they expected. Rosalie had been at the Harper Ranch kitchen table for 2 months now. Not as a guest, not as an uncertain presence managing her mother's moods, but as someone learning how a working household ran when the person running it was allowed to run it openly. She was a quick learner. Evelyn had discovered this the same way she discovered most things, by paying attention rather than assuming. "More butter in the crust," Evelyn said, passing through. "I know," Rosalie said. "You told me yesterday." "I'm reminding you." "I know," Rosalie said again, but she was smiling, and Evelyn saw it and kept walking, because the best thing she could do for Rosalie's growing confidence was to trust it and let it be. The trade office meeting was in Helena. Alexander rode with her not because she needed an escort, a point. She made clearly, and he accepted without argument, but because he had business with the Territorial Water Authority in Helena the same week, and they were, as he put it, with characteristic directness, going the same direction. They made the journey over 2 days. They talked the whole way about the protocol proposal, about the Whitlock Ranch's supply contracts, about the Brannan supplemental claim, about the North Corridor water table conditions that Alexander had been watching since the spring runoff. They stopped overnight at a stage inn where the proprietor looked at them with the specific curiosity of a small-town person assessing a situation that did not fit into an immediately available category. And Evelyn looked back at him with the comfortable steadiness of a woman who had decided that other people's categories were their own concern. The trade office was a large stone building on Helena's main administrative street. The chief inspector was a thin man named Garrett, with reading spectacles and the careful, evidence-minded manner of someone who had spent his career trying to prove things that people did not want proven. He shook Evelyn's hand and looked at her with the frank, assessing attention of a man who had read her proposal and was evaluating whether the person matched the document. She sat across from him and answered his questions for 3 hours. He asked about the methodology, how she had developed it, what the recording interval was, how she handled shipment days when she was not personally present, how she managed the documentation security. She answered everything precisely because precision was what the questions deserved, and because she had been living inside this methodology for 3 years and knew it the way you know something you have built yourself from the inside out. At the end of the 3 hours, Garrett set his notes down and said, "Miss Harper, the trade office would like to commission a formal publication of this methodology. A guide written by you for distribution to ranching operations across the territory. We would also like to invite you to present it at the Territorial Ranchers Convention in October." She looked at him. "The convention," she said. 200 ranchers, land managers, and supply operators," he said. "The legislature's Agriculture Committee will be in attendance." He paused. "The supply fraud bill is going to vote in November. Your documentation is already in the record. A presentation from the person who developed the methodology would..." He paused. "It would be significant." She was quiet for a moment. She thought about the barn, and the scale, and the notebook. She thought about 30 months of feed weights written in the dark. She thought about what Beatrice had said, you always saw too much, and about the fact that seeing too much was exactly what had brought her to this room, to this conversation, to a man with reading spectacles asking her to address 200 ranchers and a legislative committee about what happened when you refused to stop looking. "All right," she said. Garrett almost smiled. "We'll arrange the details. You'll be contacted before the end of the month." She walked out of the trade office into the Helena Street where Alexander was waiting with the horses, and she told him what Garrett had said, and he listened without interrupting, which was what she needed, and when she finished he said, "The October convention." "Yes." "I'll be there," he said. "You're a delegate. I'm also," he said, "the man who would like to watch you walk into a room of 200 ranchers and tell them what you know." He paused. "Those are not incompatible." She looked at him. She thought about Thursday suppers and water rights clauses and a man who had taken his hat off before he opened a door because that was simply who he was. She thought about, "I intend to keep coming back," and the specific quality of a promise made not with performance, but with the steady, unhurried certainty of someone who meant what they said because they had decided to say only what they meant. She said, "I want to ask you something." "All right," he said. "When you rode back to the Harper Ranch after the gathering the second time, the Thursday meeting, you came to the barn instead of the house. You knew I'd be in the barn." "Yes," he said. "How did you know?" He looked at her directly. "Because the barn was where the actual work was happening," he said. "And you were always where the actual work was happening. That was the most reliable thing I'd learned about you in 48 hours. She looked at him for a long moment, and what moved through her was not the complicated, cautious thing she had been managing for months. The careful parceling of feeling the measured pace. The habit of protection she had built over 12 years of being in rooms where wanting things led to having them taken. What moved through her was simpler than that. Warmer. More immediate. "Alexander," she said. "Evelyn," he said. "I think," she said, "that you should ask me the question you've been working up to for the past 6 weeks. He was still. Then the corner of his mouth moved. You noticed? I notice things, she said. You know that. Howe was quiet for a moment. The Helena Street moved around them, wagons people, the ordinary commerce of a territorial capital, on a Thursday afternoon. And he stood in the middle of all of it with his hat in his hand, the way he had stood in the doorway of a locked kitchen 2 months ago, and he looked at her. Evelyn Harper, he said. I would like to marry you. Not because of the ranch or the water rights or the records or anything that belongs to business. Because of who you are, when you are simply being who you are, which is the most considerable person I have encountered in my adult life. He paused. I am aware that this requires you to have opinions about it, and I am prepared to hear them. She looked at him. She thought about a barn door and a kitchen floor and a gray dress and 30 months of notebooks. She thought about, don't stop doing that, said in a barn, while fiddle music played. She thought about everything that had happened between that night and this street, and about what it meant to stand here right now, with her name on a water rights agreement and a trade office proposal in her saddlebag, and a convention speech to write, and to be asked a question like this, by a man like this. She said, I have 3 conditions. Of course you do, he said. My name stays on the Harper Ranch operational documents. My father needs that continuity for at least 2 more years while we stabilize the operation. Agreed, he said. The Whitlock Ranch supply contracts implement the documentation protocol by spring, all 63 of them. I was already planning to, he said. What's the 3rd? She looked at him. Thursday suppers, she said. That's ours. Whatever else is happening, the ranch, the water rights, the convention, the legislature. Thursday supper is not a business meeting. He looked at her for a moment. Something in his expression shifted, not the controlled, almost smile she had learned to read over the past months, but something fuller, something that had stopped managing itself and was simply there. Agreed, he said. Evelyn, is that a yes? Yes, she said. Alexander, that's a yes. He reached out and took her hand, and they stood in the Helena Street in the Thursday afternoon light. And it was not a dramatic gesture, and it was not a performance, and no one in the street stopped to look at them. And that was exactly right, because this was not a moment that needed an audience. It was simply a moment that needed to be real. And it was real. They rode home the next morning, and the 2-day journey back to Red Willow had a different quality from the journey out, not quieter, not less busy with conversation, but different in the way that things are different when the ground you are on has changed, and both people know it and are not pretending otherwise. They talked about the protocol guide and the convention speech, and the Brannan supplemental claim, and the East herd breeding schedule, and they talked about the Whitlock Ranch's north operations and the water table readings for the fall. And at some point, they talked about nothing in particular, and were quiet together for a stretch of miles, without the quiet being uncomfortable. And that was its own kind of thing. They arrived at the Harper Ranch in the late afternoon. Thomas was in the yard. He looked at them ride in together, and looked at their faces, and read something there, and he said nothing, but he took Alexander's horse and gave Evelyn a look that was the specific look of a father who has figured something out and is choosing not to make it into a production. Evelyn went into the kitchen. Rosalie was there with supper on the stove, and the pie on the windowsill, and the kitchen, looking more like a kitchen used by people who wanted to be in it than it had looked in 12 years. Rosalie looked at Evelyn's face. She said, something happened. Several things happened, Evelyn said. The trade office is publishing the protocol. I'm speaking at the October convention, and Alexander asked me to marry him. Rosalie was very still. Then she said, what did you say? Yes, Evelyn said. Rosalie sat down at the kitchen table. She looked at her hands. She was quiet for a moment, and Evelyn watched her, and she understood that Rosalie was processing something that was complicated, not the engagement itself, but what the engagement meant in the context of a family that had been arranged against Evelyn for 12 years, in a house where Rosalie's mother had once prepared Rosalie to attract the man who had just proposed to her stepsister. "Howe was never going to choose me," Rosalie said. She said it without self-pity, just as an accurate observation. "I know that now. I think I knew it then, even when she was preparing me." She looked up. "He was looking for someone like you. I don't think he knew it, but he was." "You don't need to be chosen by a man like Alexander Whitlock," Evelyn said. You need to decide what you want and go toward it. Rosalie looked at her. Is that what you did? Evelyn thought about 30 months of notebooks and a locked chest and a kitchen floor. She thought about whether any of what she had done was going toward what she wanted or simply refusing to stop being herself regardless of what it cost. She thought about the difference between those two things and whether there was one. I refused to disappear, she said. That's where it started. The rest of it came from that. Rosalie nodded slowly. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I want to learn the breeding records, the documentation system, the way you track the herd cycles. She said it carefully, the way someone says something they have been working up to for a while. I've been watching you work for 2 months, and I want to know how you do it. Not because I need to, because I want to. Evelyn looked at her half-sister. She thought about 21 years old, and wrong lessons from the wrong teacher, and the specific courage of wanting to unlearn them. She thought about the kitchen table, and the apple pie, and more butter in the crust. Monday morning, she said. Come to the barn at 6. Bring a notebook. Rosalie's face changed, not dramatically, not with the performed joy of someone who had been told to appear pleased, but with the quiet, tentative expression of someone who has been handed something real and is not quite sure yet how to hold it. All right, she said. 6 o'clock. Supper that evening was Thomas and Evelyn and Rosalie and Alexander at a table with 4 chairs, all 4 of them occupied, which had become the ordinary arrangement in the Harper house over the past 2 months, and which still occasionally struck Evelyn with the particular freshness of something that had been missing for a long time and was now simply there. Thomas said over supper without particular ceremony, I understand congratulations are in order, Alexander said. She gave me 3 conditions before she said yes. Thomas looked at Evelyn. Only 3. I was being concise, she said. Thomas almost laughed a real laugh, the kind that had been scarce in this house for a decade and was becoming less scarce. Slowly, the way spring comes to Montana, not all at once, but increment by increment, one warmer morning at a time. The wedding was set for the following spring. Not because either of them needed that long, but because the water rights agreement had a 12-month review clause that required operational continuity at the Harper Ranch, and because the trade office publication was going to take until February to finalize, and because Evelyn's convention speech needed to be given in October, and she was not going to organize a wedding in the same month she addressed the Territorial Ranchers Convention. Alexander accepted this timeline with the ease of a man who understood that the woman he was going to marry had a full life that a wedding needed to fit around rather than the other way, and who was entirely comfortable with that. October came. The convention was in Billings. 200 ranchers, the Legislative Agriculture Committee, 3 representatives from the Territorial Governor's office. Evelyn stood at the front of that room with her notes in her hand and looked out at 200 faces, most of them male, most of them weathered and experienced and skeptical in the particular way of people who have been told new things before and found most of them not worth the time. She said, 3 years ago I started weighing feed shipments because the numbers didn't match the invoices. I didn't tell anyone. I bought a notebook and a scale, and I wrote down what I found every delivery, every variance, every date. I did this because I could not stand not knowing the truth about the operation I was responsible for. The room was quiet. 30 months later, she said, that notebook was in a Territorial Trade Office investigator's hands. 7 ranch families received restitution. A supply fraud operation that had been running for 3 years across 2 counties was dismantled. And the methodology I used, which is not complicated, which is not expensive, which requires only a scale and a ledger, and the willingness to write down what you find, is what I am here to show you today. She showed them. She walked them through the protocol step by step, and she answered questions, and when a rancher in the 3rd row said, "My foreman handles the supply receipts. I don't have time for this," she said without missing a beat. Then teach your foreman the protocol. It takes 20 minutes to learn and 15 minutes a week to maintain. What it costs you in time is considerably less than what it will save you in money. She paused. Unless you prefer not to know. The room was very quiet. Alexander, sitting in the 2nd row with his delegate's badge and his hat on his knee, looked at her with the expression she had first seen in a hotel kitchen in Helena. Not quite a smile, something more substantial, Something that belonged to a man who was watching a person be exactly who they are and finding it the most compelling thing in the room. She looked back at him for one moment. Then she looked at the room. "This protocol is being published by the Territorial Trade Office next month," she said. "It will be available to every ranching operation in Montana. If you take one thing from this presentation, take this. The information that protects your operation is already available to you. It is in your shipment records and your delivery logs and the gap between what you are invoiced and what you actually receive." She paused. "You simply have to be willing to look at it. And to keep looking. Even when no one is asking you to. Even when you are not sure it will ever matter." She looked at the room. "It will matter. I promise you it will matter." The room was still for a moment. Then someone started clapping, and it moved through the audience the way things move through a room when they are real. Not with the forced energy of politeness, but with the specific weight of a group of people who have recognized something true. She drove the protocol bill through the legislative committee's awareness with the specific leverage of a woman who had documentation where others had anecdote, and the bill went to the full legislature in November with the Agriculture Committee's endorsement. It passed in December. The Evelyn Harper Supply Verification Act. That was what the territorial newspaper called it in a front-page story that the Post delivered to the Harper Ranch on a Wednesday morning in January, while the snow was coming down outside and the kitchen fire was burning, and Rosalie was at the table with her own breeding records notebook, working through the winter herd data with the focused efficiency of a young woman who had discovered that she was good at this and was no longer apologizing for wanting to be. Thomas read the newspaper. He set it on the table. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Evelyn Grace Harper." She looked up from the stove. "You have a law named after you," he said. She looked at the newspaper. She thought about 3 years and a notebook and a scale. She thought about 30 months of numbers written in the dark. She thought about Beatrice's face and the kitchen door and a man who had taken his hat off before he knew who was inside. "Yes," she said, "I do." She went back to the stove because breakfast did not make itself, and the irrigation crew was coming at 8, and the East Herd Review was scheduled for 10, and Alexander was riding over at noon with the Whitlock Ranch's spring supply contract adaptations for her to review. Thomas watched her for a moment. Then he picked up his coffee. He said quietly the way people say the things they mean the most. "Your mother was right about you." Evelyn did not turn around. She did not need to. "I know," she said. "She told me." The wedding was held in May on the Harper Ranch under the cottonwood trees that had been growing along the creek boundary since before Thomas Harper broke this ground. The same people who had stood in a barn 8 months ago and watched Evelyn walk in on Alexander's arm. Were there the ranching families, the Red Willow townspeople, Gus and the ranch hands who had known for years what she was worth and had waited a long time for the rest of the world to catch up. The old rancher with the white side whiskers. The one who had said bolted in a barn while a fiddle player stood with his bow. Uncertain, shook her hand before the ceremony and said, "Finest thing I saw in 1874 was a woman walking out of a locked kitchen with her head up. Second finest thing I'm about to see is what comes next." He released her hand and went to find his seat. She stood with Alexander under the cottonwoods and said the words that needed saying, and he said them back with the same directness he brought to everything, and neither of them was performing anything for anyone. Thomas walked her to the cottonwood trees. He offered his arm and she took it, and they walked together, the way they had been learning to walk together for 8 months carefully with attention, covering the ground between where they had been and where they were going, one honest step at a time. Rosalie stood near the front in a yellow dress she had chosen herself with her breeding records notebook in the ranch house, and 6 months of real work behind her, and an expression on her face that was not the practiced pleasantness of a girl performing what her mother required, but the genuine, slightly tentative look of a young woman who is discovering incrementally who she is when she is allowed to simply be it. The ceremony ended. People ate. Music played. The Harper Ranch in May was everything a ranch in May should be, alive and loud and full of the particular noise of a place where people and animals and land have decided to keep going together. Late in the evening, when the guests had thinned and the music had slowed and the cottonwoods were dark against the last of the light, Evelyn stood at the creek boundary with Alexander beside her and looked at the south tributary, where the seasonal backflow ran, that the county map had missed, and she had found herself walking this land 3 years ago with a notebook and a purpose. "The Brannons got their supplemental recovery," Alexander said. "Final settlement came through last week. My lawyer confirmed it this morning." She had not known. He had been carrying that piece of good news, waiting for the right moment. "All 7 families," she said. "All 7, he said. She looked at the creek. She thought about all of it every morning, every number, every notebook page, every locked door and unlocked chest and letter, written to the Territorial Trade Office, before she talked herself out of it. She thought about the law with her name on it, and the convention speech, and the 63 Whitlock supply contracts, now running on her protocol, and the 200 ranchers who had left the Billings Convention with her documentation guide in their saddlebags. She thought about what it meant to refuse to disappear, to simply stubbornly continue to be exactly yourself in the place where someone has decided you should be invisible, to write down what you find, to keep looking, to keep going. Even when no one is asking you to, even when you are not sure it will ever matter, it matters. She had promised the convention room it would matter, and she had known when she said it that she was not guessing. Alexander put his hand over hers on the fence rail. She turned her palm up and held it. She looked at the creek running silver in the last light, the same water that had been running here before any of them were born, and would be running here long after seasonal and variable, and nothing like what the map said, real and true, and hers to know, because she had walked it herself and refused to accept someone else's account of what she would find. Evelyn Harper Whitlock had been locked in a kitchen and stripped of her dress and told in 100 small and deliberate ways that she did not deserve to be seen. She had seen herself anyway. She had done the work anyway. She had written down the truth anyway in a notebook no one asked for by a fire. She built herself before the sun came up on mornings when no one was watching. And in the end, in the full, complete, unambiguous end, the world had not erased her. She had made herself impossible to erase.